Chapter 675. In a hidden cave 100 meters underground, a new Zerg nest was slowly being nurtured. The remaining 23,000 insects were sent out by Bliss in batches, risking being annihilated by the elves and rushing to the surface to plunder for food. Although they brought back a lot of jungle creatures, their own losses were not small. Almost every day, they would lose 1,000 to 2,000 insect soldiers. At this rate, Bliss would be out of insects in less than 10 days. He kept the remaining 6 demonic mantises with him at all times, which allowed him to preserve the foundation of some high-level battle insects. At the edge of the west coast, some scattered insect armies and demonic mantises were hiding in various corners of the illusory forest. Once this place was lost, even if Bliss' main body was killed by the elves, he could use the monarch insect hidden in another insect army to resurrect. However, the price to pay for such a resurrection was too great, and it was very likely that his strength would fall back to the initial stage of Grade 1. Hence, unless it was necessary, he was not willing to use this method to escape the enemy's encirclement. After trying for a few days, Bliss had already given up on asking for help from Adamari. It was because of his rash action of asking for help that the Vengeance Spear used the weak elemental undulations to track his tracks. In that battle, he was even forced to give up his 10,000 insect army to act as bait to lure the enemy away. Unfortunately, the illusory forest was the home of the forest elves, after all. Here, the slightest movement or trace would attract the attention of the elves. Hence, Bliss's arduous escape was destined to be bumpy, and he was almost caught by the Grade 3 elf in his temporary residence a few times. After playing a game of cat and mouse with the Vengeance Spear AI Jaya for more than 6,000 kilometers, Bliss had yet to officially meet her. Even so, his insect army had fallen from its peak of 170,000 to the current 20,000, and the intermediate Grade 1 demonic mantises had also fallen from 27 to 6. The bitterness and tears of blood and tears were difficult to understand and experience for those who were not personally involved. Here at the foot of this strange eagle nest mountain, although Bliss did not leave his house, he could still roughly understand the situation outside through the hidden eye insects. It could be seen that his previous unscrupulous actions had completely enraged those elves. Every day, the elven aerial cavalry patrolling the vicinity of the Eagle Nest Mountain never stopped. Within the forest, it was guarded by the elves, flying scouts, and druids disguised as small animals, just like an impenetrable fortress. Without enough blood and flesh, it would be difficult to breed an endless stream of insect armies. Without high-quality flesh and blood, it would be difficult to breed powerful insects. However, at this moment, they were completely surrounded by enemies, and any insect swarms that were sent out on the ground would not be able to return. However, the insect which Bliss still did not give up hope of escaping. Taking advantage of the gap before the elves' encirclement closed, Bliss sent out a large number of insect armies to snatch back some blood food. Bliss used the food and the sacrifice of some ordinary insects to nurture a group of strange insects with special abilities in the new worm nest, the ankheggs. This was a strange worm that looked like a large earthworm. Its body was 12 meters long, and its front end was densely packed with countless concentric sharp teeth. These sharp teeth extended all the way to its pitch-black body. They were its basic tools for gnawing and crushing everything. The ankheggs did not mind meat or cold. As long as it could absorb organic matter, its terrifying stomach could crush and digest it. Under Blitz's command, although the insect swarms also had the ability to burrow into the ground, their evolved body structure was still mainly for tearing and gnawing on flesh and blood. Using them to burrow underground would not only cause a huge commotion, but it would also be shockingly slow. Hence, in order to dig a way out, Blitz had no choice but to sacrifice a little of the insect swarms, using their flesh and shells to breed these special ankheggs. When the first ankhegg broke out of the nest and appeared in front of Blitz, the excitement in his heart was no less than when he successfully became an insect witch. Unfortunately, before he could take a closer look at the ankhegg, More than a dozen insects were killed in one of the insect tunnels half a mile away. The insect which Bliss sighed helplessly before gritting his teeth and laughing sinisterly. These days, the druids had become bolder and bolder. They entered the underground maze again and again, searching for traces of Blitz in the twisting and turning insect tunnels and underground cracks. Some of them were rank 1 druids, and some of them were rank 1 druids. As long as Blitz sent out the remaining 6 demonized mantises, they would be able to teach the druids an unforgettable lesson in such a confined space. However, many druid squads had a few grade 2 druids hidden in them. If the demonized mantises encountered them, the chances of them escaping were less than 30%. Hence, every time the druids killed the insect soldiers in the periphery, it was Blitz's turn to hesitate. He did not know if he should send the demonized mantises to encircle them. This kind of suffering was tormenting him almost every single day, every single moment. In previous battles, Blitz could only reluctantly give up on counterattacking whenever he encountered an unknown enemy. The main reason was that he was worried about his future. He had to have a combat soldier that could protect him. Now that he had the Ankh eggs and had a chance to escape, Blitz's mentality underwent a huge change. Blitz was now in a state where he could advance and retreat at will. Blitz also had the intention to have a good time with his enemies. Hence, the insect army that had been on the defensive for the past few days once again swarmed into the tunnels and insect tunnels, attacking the druid combat teams from all directions. As the intensity of the battle increased, some unclear information began to pour into Blitz's mind like raindrops. When the entire underground labyrinth battle situation was presented in front of him, he quickly chose an opponent for himself. It was a combat team made up of 3 grade 1 druids. One of them transformed into a 10-meter-long python and was responsible for scouting and opening up a path. As for the other 2, one of them transformed into a giant gopher and sniffed the air in the tunnels with its sharp nose, while the other transformed into a toad with goosebumps all over its body. It lay on the python's body and observed the surroundings with its large eye sockets. Along the way, the rancid stench of the underground tunnels annoyed the 3 druids to no end. Although they had taken on the appearance of magical beasts and possessed the might of magical beasts, they were still humans in their hearts. Therefore, they could only endure the vile and filthy environment underground, but they could not enjoy it. The 3 of them formed a team. The python was adept at sensing the slight tremors of the ground. The flash rat could sniff out strange auras, and the poison dart frog had excellent senses for movement. They complemented each other and worked well together. They silently searched for the forks and directions of the tunnels before them, while using nature spells to leave special magical marks along the way. Because of their continuous advancement, the underground maze that was dug out by the swarm of insects at the foot of the Eagle Nest Mountain had been illuminated. Perhaps in less than 2 days, they would be able to completely explore the complicated underground maze that was filled with forks, insect tunnels, and branching tunnels. By then, the entire underground maze would be filled with magical marks. It would be difficult for the insects to use the darkness and chaos to move around. As long as they could detect the presence of the insect, which the detestable fellow would not be able to escape with the help of a few grade 2 druid masters. The dark, deep, and narrow tunnels stretched out in front of them. It was pitch black. Without night vision, the creatures on the surface would not be able to see anything here. The tunnels were not more than a meter wide. If the elven archers were to come down here, they would probably have to crawl forward with a miserable expression. If it were the elven warriors who were good with dual blades, they might not even be able to draw their blades, let alone fight. Hence, when it came to adapting to the battlefield, the druids were much more suitable than other combat occupations. No, we seem to be surrounded by enemies. A giant python in the lead suddenly stopped moving. It used its sharp senses to detect the familiar rustling sounds coming from all the insect tunnels and tunnels within a radius of half a mile. It was as if a large number of insect armies were surging towards their location through the winding tunnels from all directions. Ever since the swarm suffered a few heavy blows, It was rare to see such a large swarm of insects ambushing them. "Why don't we retreat first and report the movement of the swarm?" The flash rat raised its body, and a human-like expression of hesitation appeared on its furry gray face. There were a total of 11 druid teams searching for the insect witch underground, and only 5 of them had grade 2 druid masters. Unfortunately, their team didn't have such a thing. Hence, when the flash rat sensed the movements of the swarm in the distance, it could not help but cower in fear. After all, the combat power that they could unleash was limited in this narrow and enclosed space. They could not cast any powerful nature spells, or the mud and gravel that fell down would be enough to kill them. If we retreat rashly, the insects will definitely take the opportunity to destroy the marks we left behind. Our whole day's work would have been in vain. We might as well not advance or retreat. "Thor, go to the right fork. There's a stone hall 30 meters away from us. It's not big, but it's enough for us to fight inside. I've already sent out a request for help. As long as we stay here for a while, the surrounding teams will definitely come to support us." In the end, it was the most experienced poison dart frog that made the final decision. The team of 3 did not hesitate. The flash rat and poison dart frog pounced on the giant python's body and quickly slithered forward along the pitch-black tunnel under its weight. When the 3-way fork suddenly appeared, it rushed straight into the rightmost tunnel. It was almost a body's length away from them. Dense, rustling sounds came from afar, and a dense swarm of insects rushed out from all the tunnels and forks. Without hesitation, they followed the giant python into the tunnel on the right. Chapter 676. In this dark and narrow passageway, a terrifying and bloody massacre was going on. The druid that had transformed into a terrifying python opened its mouth, spitting venom and biting. Every attack could cause significant damage to the swarm of insects in front of it. The long tail that it dragged behind, it was also waving around with all its might, smashing the swarm of insects into puddles of blood. Unfortunately, these insects did not seem to know what death was at all, and were still rushing over from both ends of the tunnel without a care for their own safety. Even if they were about to be crushed to death by the python in the next second, they still tried their best to bite the python's body. Under the fearless and ferocious attack of the swarm of insects, even though the giant python had a body of steel and was protected by dense snake scales, it was still riddled with wounds by the densely packed black beetles that crawled all over its body. There were even countless fine and dense wounds on its body. The flash rat and poison arrow frog that were crouching on the python's body were doing their best to clean up the swarm of insects that were pouncing on them. The burning spells and the venom arrows killed and injured countless black beetles, and the number of beetles that were burned into charcoal or melted into stinky mucus by the venom was even more uncountable. The entire tunnel was filled with an indescribable stench. After charging and attacking with great difficulty in the swarm of insects, the python finally brought its 2 companions into the rather spacious stone hall after crashing through a wall of insects. Although it was called a stone hall, it was actually just a cave with a circumference of 10 meters that was eroded by the underground water. Now that the underground water had changed its course, it was left with a damp and cold underground stone hall. Although it was still very narrow, it was much higher than the 1-meter-tall insect tunnel. The 3 druids had just rushed into the stone hall when they quickly returned to their human forms. They then raised their oak staves and cast rejuvenation and quick recovery on their bodies with all their might. Unfortunately, before they could heal their injuries, the swarm of insects that were following closely behind came out of the tunnels and cracks of various sizes and madly pounced on them again. Roar after a deafening roar that shook the entire underground labyrinth, a druid quickly transformed into a gigantic violent earth bear and charged towards the horde of insects without hesitation. As for the other 2 druids, one of them transformed into a berserk ape and charged towards a swarm on the other side. The other quickly transformed into a treant. He first used a large area of thorns to trap the swarming insects, and then shook out a green halo to enchant his companion with various supportive nature spells. Bramble armor, nature blessings, tree skin, Vitality, regeneration. Among them, tree skin could make the target's skin as tough as 100-year-old tree bark, which could withstand low-intensity sharp weapons. The armor of thorns could form a magic shield made of green vines and thorns on the target's body. Not only could it resist physical and elemental damage, but it could also reflect some melee damage. Nature's Blessing was the most commonly used supportive nature spell by the elves. It could increase the target's strength, agility, vitality, and elemental resistance. Vitality regeneration could continuously replenish the target's stamina and mental strength, and it lasted for about 120 seconds. Although the elves were tall and slender, in terms of strength and physique, they were naturally inferior to those plump and terrifying magic beasts. However, with the layers of magical buffs, even a harmless rabbit could become as ferocious as a lion that had been through hundreds of battles. Hence, in this simple stone hall that was less than 10 meters wide, the three druids started a bloody battle with a swarm of insects that were swarming towards them. Due to the narrow area, both sides did not have much space to dodge or move. The only thing they could do was to use their bodies to resist the enemy's attacks and then retaliate fiercely. In such a situation, battle techniques and killing methods were not essential. The only thing that could be effective was a strong physical defense and fierce attacks. In the beginning, with the protection of the tree skin spell and the armor of thorns, the two meat shield druids could still resist the crazy hammering, slapping, and ramming of the swarm. However, when the green shield was torn into pieces by the swarm of insects, the violent earth bear could only roar and put on a layer of rock armor. A similar yellow armor appeared on the body of the violent giant baboon. They chose to transform into earth-type magical beasts, which had always been tough and tough. Hence, after losing the elemental defense, they could still rely on their own strength to resist the insects. The treant that was protected in the middle was now tightly surrounded by the swarm of beetles. It could only lift its wooden legs and trample on the insects. Its thick arms turned into long tree whips, and it lashed at the thick swarm of insects. Insect blood splattered, and the carapace shattered. The entire hall was trembling and swaying. Hoarse battle roars filled the hall, as well as the muffled sounds of being smashed and whipped, as well as the strange cracking sounds that filled the ears. The three tall figures in the stone hall were gradually overturned by the black swarm of insects, and it was difficult to see their heroic posture when they were fighting. It was only through the splatter of insect corpses that they knew that they were still alive and fighting tenaciously. Just when the three druids were busy dealing with the swarm of insects, a few long and narrow black figures climbed up the cave wall and appeared above their heads. In the next second, following a command, the six mantises split into three groups and swooped down ferociously from the sky. Their abnormally sharp sickle-like appendages stabbed or slashed the bodies of the three druids from all angles. A loud roar of pain instantly lingered in the stone hall of the underground cave and spread in all directions along the winding cracks and tunnels of the stone stratum. In another secret tunnel, a team of three druids was fighting with all their might. Suddenly, a low and hoarse roar of pain came from the depths of the cave. A druid that had turned into a cheetah raised his head, and his expression was one of shock and anger. "It's Thor." Something happened to their team. This druid was obviously close to Thor. At this moment, when he heard Thor's miserable roar, his heart was like boiling oil, and he was anxious and angry to the extreme. However, no matter how fast he sped up the attack speed of his shadow claws, he wanted to kill the hundreds of beetles in front of him, but he couldn't do anything. In the team, the druid that had turned into a woodpecker and had been slowly trimming his feathers suddenly had a fierce look in his eyes. He leaped forward, and his body suddenly expanded and changed shape. In the blink of an eye, he transformed from a harmless woodpecker into a flaming lion that was wreathed in magical flames. As soon as his strong and powerful body took shape, the raging flames burned the remaining black beetles in the tunnel into a pile of charcoal. He looked back with his majestic lion head and shouted, "Follow me closely." Then, without looking back, he rushed into the darkness in the distance. Along the way, the raging flames expanded and contracted from time to time, burning the beetles that kept coming out of the cracks in the tunnel. He quickly leaped into the depths of the tunnel. With the strength of a rank 2 flaming lion, these scattered beetles could not stop his advance at all. The 2 rank 1 druids were pleasantly surprised as they followed the scorching path of fire closely behind the rank 2 druid master. However, just as the druid master rushed through a section of the tunnel and rushed into a fork, the tunnel he passed through suddenly collapsed. The 2 rank 1 druids stopped in their tracks in shock. However, before they could figure out what was going on, there was a strange rustling sound in the tunnel behind them. The black swarm of insects crawled out from different tunnels, and cracks in the stone, blocking them here. And behind the dense swarm of beetles, in the shadow of the tunnel, 4 black figures were also quietly approaching them. After a dozen or so flicking fingers, there were also the painful screams of the 2 druids before they died. To be on the safe side, even if it was just to deal with the rank 1 beginner druids, Bug-Lich Bliss had to send 2 rank 1 intermediate demonized mantises. Coupled with the dense swarm of beetles, the druids who had been cut off had no chance of escaping. Bliss, who already had a way to escape, could not bring such a large number of beetles with him. In order to maximize the strength of the remaining 20,000 beetles, Bug-Lich Bliss was simply stirring things up in a frenzy. Using his familiarity with the underground maze and his grasp of the entire battlefield, Bug-Lich Bliss was practically playing around with strategies like besieging reinforcements, intercepting midway, and setting up ambushes. At the cost of quickly exhausting the beetles, he sent all the druid teams into the sea of beetles, then set up ambushes and bait them as he pleased. As long as a rank 1 druid was alone, even if it would cost him thousands of beetles, he would not hesitate to attack. Either he would collapse the tunnels to cut off the enemies, or he would send his beetle army to tie down the rank 2 druids. In any case, as long as he could find an opportunity, the rank 1 druids that had fallen into his trap would not be able to escape unscathed. Using the advantages of the underground maze to its fullest, the number of casualties among the druids that had infiltrated the underground began to soar. At the start, the hidden rank 2 druids did not realize the severity of the situation. When they sensed their life auras disappearing one by one, they could no longer hold back and erupted with all their might. At this time, the number of beetles had decreased from the initial 21,000 to less than 4,000. Sensing the energy waves that were continuously exploding in the underground maze, Bug-Lich Bliss finally gave the order to retreat. The remaining beetles seemed to have gone mad, madly charging at the remaining druid teams. Using a hidden passage, Bug-Lich Bliss led 5 demonized mantises and 1,000 carefully selected beetles to gather in an underground area. The newly hatched Ankheg was currently there, devouring the druid corpses that the beetle army had sent over. In just half an hour, its strength had increased by leaps and bounds, evolving from a larva to a mature form. "Let's go." Bliss, who was wrapped in a black robe, hissed softly. The Ankheg, which had grown a few times thicker than before, crawled towards the wall like a giant earthworm. Its movement speed was so slow that it made one's hair stand on end. However, when the front end of its bloated, fleshy body rested on the rock wall, its ring-shaped, densely packed teeth gently pierced and sucked, digging out a 1.5-meter wide circular tunnel in the rock layer that was as hard as steel. Although the Ankheg's body was made of muscle and fibers, it was more than capable of dealing with soil and rock. Like a fish thrown into the water, the Ankheg's swollen and sluggish body suddenly became abnormally agile. A smooth and wide tunnel appeared in front of Bliss at a speed visible to the naked eye, and it continued to extend forward. The insect witch Bliss nodded in satisfaction. He lifted his legs and sat on a demonized mantis. With its help, he burrowed into the insect tunnel. The rest of the demonized mantises followed one after another, while the 1,000 beetles at the back tried their best to destroy the tunnel behind them as they advanced. Chapter 677. We're being watched, Alice said nonchalantly. She was currently sitting elegantly in front of a wooden table, slowly arranging the tarot cards in her hands. The back of each card was engraved with exquisite and mysterious patterns. In the eyes of an outsider, these patterns were flashy and bright, but they seemed to be meaningless magic lines. However, in the eyes of the Witches of Destiny, every wave and twist of these patterns contained an indescribably mysterious aura. They were made up of twisted characters and symbols that only a fortune teller could decipher. This was clearly a dark and damp underground stone chamber. However, Alice's elegant appearance, her exquisite silk robe, the expensive velvet tablecloth on the table, and the sparkling crystal ball at the corner of the wooden table Grimm had an indescribable feeling, as if he was in an exquisite hall with a cool breeze. He held a crystal goblet and gently swirled the bright red wine in it, taking in the fragrance of the wine while quietly listening to the sweet words of the beautiful fortune teller. This was perhaps one of the special qualities of the Witches of Destiny. They could always pull one's spirit out of the real world and embed it into an intoxicating fantasy that one would not want to wake up from for a long time. Grimm rubbed his right hand, confirming that there was no crystal goblet in his hand. He then awkwardly straightened his body and asked with furrowed brows, "Can you confirm who they are?" "A clone of the Moonlight Goddess, high grade 3. Can't escape." Alice was still flipping the tarot cards leisurely. "We've already offended her. Believe it or not, as long as our location is exposed, she will definitely kill us. Do you believe that if our location is exposed, a portal will immediately open and hordes of grade 2 and 3 powerhouses will come running out?" Grade 2 and 3 powerhouses. Grimm gritted his teeth as he felt a headache coming on. The Crimson family could only be considered a newly established Magus family, and most of the family members were only at the early or middle grade one. If they were to bump into a clone of the Moonlight Goddess with such strength, she would be able to kill them as easily as killing a few ants. The reason why they were still able to live so comfortably was because of their stealth and the ability to change locations every time they fired. Once he was trapped in the Callan continent, Grimm did not want to imagine the terrible consequences. Besides, the doppelganger of the Moonlight Goddess isn't the most troublesome thing. Alice didn't seem to realize what she was saying. She was still as calm and unhurried as ever. "Are you saying that we have more troublesome enemies?" Grimm frowned even harder. "Of course." Alice pursed her lips and smiled. The cold and damp stone chamber immediately became sunny and beautiful. "Your beautiful girlfriend did a good job. She even alarmed Silsa, the elven god. But fortunately, it's only an incarnation of Silsa's will, and it's not very powerful." Grimm smiled awkwardly, intentionally or unintentionally ignoring Mary's title. Instead, he carefully asked, "What you mean by not being strong? How strong is it?" "It's only at the elementary level of level 4. Alice's smile became even brighter. "Crap, tier 4 basic." Grimm's mood instantly soured. Using the divine sense embodiment of a tier 4 elven lord god to deal with the pale, which would be akin to throwing a meat bun at a dog. However, if it was used against them, even the tier 3 dark witch Ulthar might not be able to escape unscathed. As for the rest of the sorcerers, they had no chance of survival at all. He then frowned. "Is this the main reason why you've forbidden the floating ships from going into battle?" "Of course. The two goddesses have been keeping their eyes on the southwest coast all this time. If we show ourselves, we'll be stopped by a large number of high-ranked divine spell users. Are we safe here? There should be 1 or 2 elven gods who are good at divination and prophecy, right?" Grimm suddenly grew nervous. "Oomph. By the time you think of this, the elves will already be here." Alice rolled her eyes at him in annoyance. "These days, I had a few of them carve so many anti-prophecy spell formations on the island to block the elven god's senses." At this point, Alice seemed to recall the Destiny witches who had died in the previous battle, and her eyes silently reddened. If the Destiny witches wanted to control the power of Destiny, they would inevitably have to sacrifice their own witchcraft. Without the protection of witchcraft, every Destiny witch was as fragile as a piece of paper. Thus, The Destiny Witches who boasted of controlling the power of destiny could only choose to rely on some large forces if they wanted to gain a foothold in the Magus world, where the strong stood at the peak. The Destiny Witches might have a pair of eyes that could see through the complicated world, but they did not have enough power to change or accumulate anything. Alice, for example, had used the power of destiny too frequently, causing her to overdraft her life force. Her remaining life force was not enough to support her to advance to Tier 2. Thus, if she wanted to take the risk and advance, she could only grit her teeth and enter the Fairn Plane, where there were many gods. With the help of Grimm and his subordinates from the Crimson family, Alice, who could almost be said to be powerless, was able to gain a foothold in the Callan continent. Although the current situation was still shrouded in fog, and she could not see what the next step would be, she successfully sat at the card table. The entire Callan continent was like a huge chessboard, and those who had the right to play on it were either the gods or witches like Ramuella. As for a Tier 3 witch like Ulthar, she could only act as a rampaging chess piece and did not have the right to control the flow of the game. Alice was now only a Tier 1 witch and did not have the right to play against the gods. However, the power of destiny was mysterious, and most of the time, it did not rely on face-to-face combat to win. Thus, what she needed to do now was to firmly maintain her position as the chess player and silently observe the situation on the chessboard. Then, when the time was right, she would use all her strength to capture the inconspicuous chess piece from the enemy's chessboard. It could be said that Alice's current biggest advantage was that she was too weak. It was precisely because she was so weak that all the chess players and chess pieces did not see her as someone who could be compared to the gods or the rank 4 witches. This also gave her the chance to calmly plan and control the flow of the chessboard. However, with the combination of the Witches of Destiny, the Crimson family, and the Dark Witch, it was still a little risky to change the flow of the chessboard. In the past few days, Alice had been hesitating between advancing and defending, and she was even more anxious because of the chaos in the chessboard. However, Alice had to admit that the mysterious Grimm in front of her was strong, and she did not expect that the few subordinates he randomly found would be so strange. In any case, Mary was a Tier 2 vampire sorcerer. She led a group of vicious blood knights and blood elves from the west coast all the way north, spreading the flames of war all the way to the north-central part of the illusory forest. As for the worm witch Bliss, he was even more strange. He only had the strength of a high-grade Grade 1 witch, but he was still alive and kicking in the surroundings of Greenwater City, which was filled with powerful beings, despite being surrounded by a group of Grade 2 and Grade 3 elves. One had to know that in Greenwater City, the number of Grade 4 witches and oracles alone could be counted on one hand, and the number of Grade 2 and Grade 3 elven warriors was in the double digits. An inconspicuous-looking goo-worm shaman was crawling in and out of their bed, yet was not killed. This, Alice tilted her head and pondered, but she could not think of any words to praise this adorable Lord Worm Witch. In truth, it was because of the conflict between the Worm Witch Bliss and the Blood Queen Mary that the central mountain range, which had always been shrouded in the thick fog of destiny, had finally revealed itself. Although it was still impossible to deduce anything from it, it was still a good sign. At the very least, Alice had already divined some information related to the Scepter of Prophecy. In the middle of the boundless forest of the Callan continent, a huge mountain range that was tens of thousands of meters tall suddenly rose. This mountain range stretched from the west to the east, stretching for tens of thousands of miles. In the middle of the mountain range, there were lakes, rivers, ravines, valleys, of course. Most of it was still the vast forest that rose and fell continuously. The central mountain range could be said to be the core of the entire Elven Kingdom. The huge temple district was located in the northeast of the central mountain range. There was an especially vast and quiet plain and valley there, surrounded by tall and steep mountain ranges. This was why the elven gods had opened up this vast temple district. The elven court was the ruler of the forest elves, and at the same time, the loyal servants of the elven gods. They did not dare to stand side by side with the temples of the elven gods, so they built the elven court in a dense forest adjacent to the central mountain range. There was also a towering ancient tree of life that was 30,000 years old standing there. And the entire elven court was built around this tree of life. It was said that this tree of life was personally planted by the elven god Sylvia. It was also one of her incarnations, and it was where the fate of the entire forest elves lay. As for the scepter of prophecy that Alice was determined to obtain, it belonged to a grade 2 green dragon, Ogu. The dragon cliff that this grade 2 green dragon lived in was located in the west of the central mountain range and was considered a relatively desolate place. Originally, Alice had no idea how to obtain the scepter of prophecy. Chapter 678. This was a quiet and deep canyon with a dense forest. In the depths of the undulating forest, the terrain of the continent suddenly began to meander and rise, and tall and undulating mountains could be found everywhere. And among them, a solitary mountain peak that towered into the clouds was especially eye-catching. This mountain stood proudly at the source of the western part of the central mountain range. It was tens of thousands of feet high, and the top half of the solitary mountain was even directly hidden above the drifting white clouds. On the west side of this solitary mountain, on the rugged and steep cliff, there were caves of various sizes. And those who could appear here were all huge, terrifying dragons with a dense aura. At noon, a long, resonant roar of a dragon suddenly sounded in the distant sky, and then a black dot grew from small to large, suddenly arriving at the dragon cliff of the green dragon, which was famous throughout the entire Faron Plain. The wind howled, and a huge figure pierced through the clouds, spreading its wings and soaring above the blue sky, completely displaying its proud and majestic figure in front of everyone. This was a terrifying creature that was at least 12 meters tall. Bowl-sized, dark green scales covered the entire body of the dragon, flashing with a dazzling luster under the bright and beautiful sunlight. The huge dragon's head was more than 2 meters long, and light green smoke lingered at the tip of its nose, adding a bit of mystery to it. As the huge mouth opened and closed, one could vaguely see the terrifying green ball of acid at the back of the throat. Huge and ferocious spikes extended from the back of the neck all the way to the top of the back of the spine, and as a pair of wide and scaly wings flapped rapidly, a strong gust of wind lingered around its elegant and perfect body. Green dragon. A forest green dragon that had already entered the mature stage. Green dragons were one of the most common of the Penishade dragon clans. They could breathe acid, and their combat power was relatively low. Among the Penishade dragons, their combat power was slightly stronger than that of the water dragons, so they were often regarded as a lowly dragon clan by the high-level dragons. After spreading its wings and soaring in the sky for a moment, this green dragon looked down at the towering dragon cliff and finally chose a position. It folded its wings, lowered its body, and began to dive down at high speed. At any time, at any place, the appearance of a giant dragon would always be so eye-catching. On the dragon cliff, dozens of green dragons poked their heads out of their respective caves and let out deafening roars at their companions who had unexpectedly come to visit. For a time, dragon roars resounded in the vicinity of the dragon cliff. The birds and beasts in the nearby forests were all frightened to the point of trembling. Among the many dragon roars, a particularly loud and coarse voice was especially eye-catching. "Hey, Ogu, what are you doing here in Dragoncliff? You're not welcome here." The one who spoke was a high-level green dragon that was even more muscular and experienced than the dragon that had just arrived. Looking at its huge head and thick and long dragon horns, it was actually a grade 3 green dragon. That's right. You're a disgrace to the dragon clan. We don't welcome you here." The green dragons living on the dragon's cliff seemed to have been led by that green dragon, and they all roared in different tones. Outsiders might not be able to understand anything from that deafening roar, but only the dragons could completely decipher this special language, Draconic. "Chase this thief out. Don't let him near the dragon's cliff. The powerful and arrogant dragon clan was synonymous with nobility and sacredness anywhere. They were high-level creatures that low-level creatures could only worship and look up to. But today, here, once an internal conflict broke out, every green dragon's behavior was no different from a shrew who was cursing in a wet market. The green dragon, called Aogu, was only grade 2. Facing the agitated group of dragons, he silently flapped his dragon wings and silently floated in front of the dragon's cliff, as if waiting for something. Sure enough, a moment later, as if alarmed by the turmoil and noise on the dragon's cliff, an elegant giant dragon covered in emerald dragon scales swooped down from the upper level of the dragon's cliff and gracefully arrived at the scene. Unlike the rough and strong body of ordinary green dragons, this high-level emerald dragon not only had a slender and smooth body, but even its dragon scales were exquisite. What was especially eye-catching was its noble and elegant temperament and flawless figure. The emerald female dragon's appearance immediately caused the entire place to fall silent, followed by a series of heavy, breathing sounds. Aratina. It was Aratina. As the youngest and most beautiful female emerald dragon in the forest dragons of the Kalan continent, Aratina's beauty was unparalleled, and she was recognized by all the forest dragons. Not to mention others, just the entire green dragon clan alone could form a company of people who regarded Aratina as their dream goddess. However, it was a pity that not only was Aratina beautiful, but her temperament was also extraordinarily high. Not to mention the green dragons with mixed bloodlines. She didn't even fancy any of the young Emerald Dragon Clan boys who could barely squeeze into the upper dragon category. Therefore, the issue of Aratina's spouse had always been the biggest headache for the elders of the Emerald Dragon Clan. However, other than being a little proud and arrogant, this great beauty of the dragon race, Aratina, was top-notch among the younger generation of the Emerald Dragon race, be it in terms of personality or bloodline. Hence, she attracted the green dragon subordinates to chase after her, making them drool with desire. Aratina gently flapped her pair of slender and delicate dragon wings. Facing this young green dragon who had aroused public anger, she said in a soft voice, "Aogu, you've already been expelled from the Dragon Cliff for embezzling the private wealth of your clansmen. Why did you come back?" Hearing the dragon beauty's question, the rest of the green dragons immediately followed suit. Many green dragons even flew out of their dragon caves, vigorously flapping their dragon wings and puffing out their chests, wanting to leave a good impression in front of Aratina. In the Dragon Clan Code, every dragon's private wealth was sacred and inviolable. Even their closest relatives or the great dragon god had no right to deprive them of their wealth. Therefore, stealing and forcibly occupying the wealth of other dragons was the most evil act that could incite the wrath of all dragons. And Aogu had violated this rule. It was no wonder that he was expelled from the safe and comfortable Dragon Cliff with his grade 2 body. Beautiful Aratina, I heard that you haven't chosen your partner, so I thought. Before Green Dragon Aogu could finish his words, he was interrupted by a thunderous roar. All the green dragons who had thoughts about Aratina flew out of the Dragon Cliff and circled around Aogu, cursing and roaring loudly. There were even a few arrogant fellows who rolled up their sleeves, intending to beat Aogu up. An abandoned and rebellious green dragon like him dared to pursue Aratina? All of the green dragons were agitated, and it seemed like they would start fighting at the slightest disagreement. Seeing the farce in front of her, the beautiful emerald beauty, Aratina, couldn't help but roar in anger and shame. All of you stop. Don't forget, this is the Dragon Cliff. All dragons are forbidden from fighting here. Hearing the beautiful dragon's reprimand, the young green dragons who had rolled up their sleeves retreated in embarrassment. You want to pursue me? Aratina's beautiful eyes, which were as cold as the morning stars, fell on Aogu. Yes, my beautiful Aratina, as beautiful as you are, you won't be able to find a dragon worthy of you in this group of good-for-nothings. The majestic and ferocious green dragon Aogu roared loudly. These pieces of trash, none of them are my match in a one-on-one fight. Even those emerald dragons, there aren't many that are as majestic as me. So, beautiful Retina, choose me. I will use all my wealth to decorate your beautiful palace." All the green dragons couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. In order to pursue Retina, Aogu was actually willing to take out all his personal treasures. This was simply too shocking. For a moment, all the green dragons were cursing angrily, but their voices were inevitably much softer. "I will search for the wealth I need myself. I don't need your offerings." The beautiful emerald beauty Retina proudly raised her head, the elegant dragon horns on her head blossoming with a dazzling radiance. "Then what do I have to do to win your beautiful heart?" Aogu shook his head in distress. "I might not have known in the past, but I do now," Retina said in a low voice. "A few days ago, the elven court sent us a request for assistance in battle. In the outskirts of the great magic forest, those evil witches are crazily slaughtering the elves' villages, trampling on their land. So the great magic forest needs us, the elves need us. I want to gather a group of volunteers to go with me to expel those evil witches." Hearing Retina's sonorous declaration of battle, the dragons who had been discussing just now suddenly fell silent. The green dragon's eyes revealed evasive and hesitant expressions. Many of the green dragons even exclaimed in a low voice, "What? A new round of witch calamity has broken out?" It couldn't be helped. For powerful creatures like the green dragons that stood at the top of the magical beast food chain, there weren't many creatures in the Faern Plain that could harm them. But it was a pity that witches were such a powerful and evil species. These terrifying witches all came from the legendary sorcerer world. They possessed evil, strange, and powerful witchcraft, as well as frightening witchcraft equipment. In the Faern Plain, there weren't many weapons that could directly harm a dragon's body. However, in these witches' teams, there were too many who possessed dragon-slaying weapons and methods. Thus, even the high and mighty dragons had a very high mortality rate when fighting against witches. With the green dragon status in the great magic forest, they had almost no natural enemies here. Thus, many green dragons were very reluctant to risk their lives to help the elves. However, green dragons were also part of the forest dragon race, so they naturally had a high affinity with the forest elves, who were the children of nature. Moreover, the establishment of the Dragon Cliff and the various top-notch offerings they enjoyed daily were all inseparable from the elf support. Thus, faced with the elves' request, the green dragons that were on good terms with certain elves could not help but hesitate. "I'll go." For some reason, the green dragon Aogu was the first green dragon to sign up. Under its guidance, quite a number of green dragons reported their names one after another. Chapter 679. How long are you going to hide before you make your move? In the dim underground corridor, Ulthar stopped Alice and complained in a dissatisfied tone. "That giant airship has been repaired for a long time. Instead of taking the opportunity to move around, we're hiding on this deserted island all day long. Just how long are we going to hide?" Surephone could tell that staying on the isolated island for more than 20 days had made this Tier 3 Dark Witch restless and distraught. All the witches had crossed the border to come here, shouldering the mission of their families and the expectations of their people. It had been almost 2 months since the planar gate opened. This also meant that a third of their trip to the Faern Plain had already passed, and their mission completion rate was still very low. To Ulthar, the mission of capturing a small group of elves was more than half complete. He could easily complete the mission by raiding a few other elven villages. However, the other mission, which was to steal the Pegasus Magic Spring, did not have any clues or methods from start to finish. Before coming to the Callan continent, Ulthar wanted to take the Pegasus Magic Spring from the elves with the help of the Pale Witch. But when she arrived at the Callan continent, she was helpless to find that because the forest elves had completely ruled the Callan continent, they had organized an anti-evil alliance composed of pure grade 4 combatants and oracles, completely blocking the Pale Witches on the island. Even after the witch calamity had broken out for so long, the Tier 4 Ashen Witch, Remura, had yet to set foot on Sapphire Continent. This was completely out of Ulthar's expectations. In order to prevent Mura from sending her companion spirit to sneak into the Kalan continent, Mura had to go around Greenwater City. Those elven oracles and grade 4 experts who had nothing better to do would attack the Echo Island from time to time. If Remura's companion spirit was not by her side, it would be difficult for her to withstand the combined attacks of so many grade 4 powerhouses. Hence, using this stupid method, the elves managed to restrain Mura and her companion spirit in the Echo Islands. As long as the Pale Witches didn't want to lose the best foothold in the outer seas of the Kalan continent, then Murat could only helplessly sit on the main island of the Echo Islands and wait bitterly for those bastards to come knocking on the door. To be honest, if the elves really wanted to destroy the Wizard's Pagoda on the Echo Islands, all they had to do was send the 5 level 4 elves guarding the Greenwater City. If that was the case, no matter how well-coordinated Remura was with her companion spirits, and she had the support of the Wizard's Pagoda, it would be difficult for her to deal with the disparity in power. However, due to their own calculations, the elves did not do so. Once the Echo Isles were conquered and the Pale Witches were scattered, this Tier 4, which would no longer have any scruples or worries. When the elves did not have absolute confidence in killing them, it did not seem to be a good thing to infuriate the Pale Witches. Grade 4 power was already at the peak in most planes. Even if the gods descended, the highest combat power they could display was only at the peak of Tier 4. It was just that, apart from having more high-level knowledge and skills than ordinary Tier 4 experts, they could not form an overwhelming advantage in terms of combat power. Therefore, if they destroyed the lair of the Pale Witches and allowed them to invade the Kalan continent, to wantonly kill and retaliate, then the losses faced by the Elven Kingdom might be even greater than now. It was precisely because of this that the Elven Kingdom adopted the strategy of besieging the high-level witches and continuing to beat them up. Under the impetus of this battle strategy, the Echo Islands occupied by the Pale Witches had become a training ground. Every few days, a terrible battle between Tier 4 experts would erupt. But without exception, each time there would be casualties on both sides, but the outcome was not serious. The more they watched, the longer they waited, the more Ulthar lost interest in the routine battles. She was more anxious about the passing of time. In the face of Ulthar's questioning, Alice responded with a sweet smile. "Which Ulthar, you should also know that our last action has attracted the attention of the elf goddesses. Before they shift their gazes away, any rash actions on our part could bring about a terrifying disaster to the entire team." Ulthar was silent for a moment and finally spoke. "We don't have to hide from each other. Was the arrival of the Moonlight Goddess Emissary caused by you? Otherwise, how could it be so coincidental that those divine spell users came just after we finished the battle?" Alice smiled sweetly. "We are already allies. How could we harm our allies like this? Besides, we also fought until the end for the last accident, and the price we paid was even greater than you dark witches. Would I push my fate witches to their deaths?" Faced with Alice's rhetorical question, Ulthar was speechless. In the last battle, although the dark witches suffered heavy losses, with many of them dying in succession, but except for 2 who were directly killed by the elf oracle, and even their souls did not escape, the rest had been resurrected on the Dark Island one after another. In contrast, the Fate Witches were much more miserable, with nearly half of their members lost. The wizard even spent a lot of money to summon a grade 3 giant dragon, and the giant floating ship went all out. Because of these factors, although Ulthar had always been suspicious, she could not determine the motives of the 2 parties. Now that she had something to ask of them, she could only vaguely answer this question and could not delve deeper into it. "Alice, you're the leader of the Destiny Witches. I'd like to borrow your divination power to inquire about something." Ulthar, a grade 3 witch, lowered her head to a grade 1 little witch for help. She could not help but stutter. Alice's heart skipped a beat, and the smile on her face became wider. All along, she had been curious about the purpose of the Dark Witches leaving the main team and coming to the Kalan continent. If she could grasp this point, it would be more advantageous for her to grasp the development of the whole situation. Unfortunately, these Dark Witches were very tight-lipped and she could not find any information. Now, the leader of the Dark Witches was going to tell her personally. This, no matter what, it was good news. But the more it was like this, the more Alice could not appear too enthusiastic. You want me to do divination? This is a different plane, and I don't have the help of the astrological platform. The price I have to pay is too high. Alice looked hesitant. Don't worry about this. I know the rules of the Fate Witches, and I will definitely give you a satisfactory reward. That's great. Then, why don't we go to my room? The two witches talked as they walked, and their voices gradually disappeared in the dark and damp corridor. The chase and killing in the forest continued. Both sides had done their best, but the battle was still intense and tragic. In the magical forest, teams of elves were flying, jumping from top to bottom of the ancient trees that were tens of meters tall, as agile as giant forest apes. Beneath their feet, there were bare-chested sword dancers with elven battle tattoos all over their bodies. They held long and narrow blades in their hands, and their figures flashed like lightning. In the thorny forest that was difficult for ordinary people to move, they moved as if they were flying. They are chasing, they are fighting. And the targets they were chasing and killing were the blood-red bats that were flapping their wings left and right in the dense forest. Yes, these bats were all blood-red in color, regardless of their body or fur. Every time one looked at it, it gave one a strange, eerie, and terrifying feeling. These mutated bats were obviously not common creatures in the illusory forest. Each of them seemed to have extremely high intelligence. Sometimes they would scatter and escape, and sometimes they would gather together to counterattack. Every time they pulled and counterattacked, they were so experienced and precise that people could not help but gasp in admiration. The pursuing elves knew very well that they were not creatures of the forest, nor were they mutated magical beasts, but they were a strange creation of witches that had never appeared in the Faerun Plain. Yes, they were not naturally born magical beasts, but magical creations that those evil witches had concocted using terrible witchcraft. Their name was vampires. Every blood-red bat was a vampire. They had two completely different forms. One was the current form of a bat, which could fly, escape, and hide everywhere. The other was the form of a human. Their human form made it difficult for most elves to detect their abnormality, until they revealed their bloody fangs and scarlet eyes. Like ordinary humans, they did not have hard skin and rarely wore metal armor. This caused their physical defense to be extremely low, so low that they could not defend against any physical or magical damage. But what was strange and frightening was that they possessed the frightening lifesteal regeneration and lifesteal regeneration abilities. No matter how heavy the injury was, as long as they could suck a few mouthfuls of blood, all the injuries would be completely healed in a few seconds. Even those vampires that had died and turned into ashes, when there were vampires nearby that were sucking blood, they would be reborn after a brilliant blood-red halo flashed. Just by relying on these two special abilities, the vampires, who were not strong enough and did not have long-range magic, were actually able to fight evenly with the pursuing elven army. This fully illustrated the fearsomeness of the vampires. What was even more frightening was that in the middle of this group of vampires, there was a group of fellows that were as high as grade 2. They were like the masters and controllers of this group of vampires, hiding behind the scenes, commanding the vampires to fight and retreat, playing guerrilla warfare in the vast and enormous illusory forest. As the elven army dispatched by Celestial Water City, this group of elves in front of them were not good people. Regardless of whether it was the sword dancers that acted as melee fighters or the elven archers that acted as long-range attackers, there were already over 1,000 of them. And in their team, there were druids, elven mages, hippogriff archers, elven beast tamers, and other special professions. Chapter 680. To be able to cross the border and dare to move about as they pleased, they were definitely not easy to deal with. Taking advantage of the fact that the attention of the elves in Skywater City was temporarily distracted by the worm Lich Bliss, Mary's vampire army began to snowball. However, The ravaging of the vampire army also attracted the troops sent by Skywater City to search for the remaining witches, a regular elven army numbering up to 3,000. From the chimeras to the druids to the green fairies. To be honest, the elves were treating Mary and her vampires as an army to deal with. After the hasty battle at Morgan Canyon, Mary did not hesitate to lead all the vampires and flee. It couldn't be helped. Although the vampires had strong survivability, they were still far from being able to fight against a regular elven army. Without qualified meat shields and long-range troops to provide cover, when the elves lined up, a large number of vampires were wiped out by sharp and accurate elven arrows before they could even reach them. The vampires that were lucky enough to get close to the elven army by relying on the trees and terrain were surrounded by the war dance warriors the moment they revealed themselves. Compared to real vampires, these newly transformed vampires were much weaker in terms of physique, strength, agility, and intelligence. After all, there were only a few blood elves that could withstand the violent changes in their blood and not degenerate into beasts. Those ordinary elves could only be transformed into vampires that obeyed orders. They had just completed the blood transformation and were still not used to this half-elven, half-vampires form. Although they were still agile and nimble, and their attacks were still incomparably ferocious, there was still a trace of stiffness and clumsiness when they switched between the two forms. Logically speaking, this flaw wasn't too serious, but it was too serious when it was applied to the battle dancer warrior who had super high agility. In front of the war dance warriors wielding two long and sharp elven blades, the vampires' movements were stiff and slow, clumsy and sluggish. They were simply the best practice targets. Both sides crossed each other in the dense forest, the dazzling blades rolling past, and the heads and limbs of the vampires began to fill the air. In just the first clash, 317 of Mary's 400 vampiric minions were impaled by sharp arrows in the path of their charge. The remaining 83 suffered the death of 1,000 cuts by the war dance warriors. The entire battle lasted for slightly more than 3 minutes before the vampires were completely annihilated. Hence, Mary, who had met her Waterloo, did not hesitate to lead the remaining vampires to escape. To prevent the vampires from escaping, the elven commander could only urge the elven army to give chase at full speed. As such, they were unable to maintain the stable and distinct three-dimensional defense from before. High up in the treetops, teams of elf archers rode on their hippogriffs and soared high into the sky, closely following the large swarm of bats. Fearing that they would be ambushed by the vampires, they flew at an altitude of more than 100 meters. They could only occasionally see the red bat clouds rushing left and right through the gaps in the lush canopy. Mary and the vampires did not need to attack the bats directly, but only needed to give the vampires a with a direction from time to time. At the very least, they did not allow the vampires to escape even after chasing for dozens of miles. However, just as they chased into a dense forest deep in the mountains, the cloud of bats suddenly disappeared without a trace. The overly lush leaves and the massive treetops that were several acres in size made it extremely difficult for them to track the vampires. Without a choice, the elven leader could only descend on the fire dance team and circle above the treetops, wanting to see what was happening below. However, just as the entire team of horned eagle archers were forced to descend, the forest below them suddenly shook, and 6 blood-colored figures charged out. These figures all had great demon-like bat wings on their backs. As the bat wings flapped, they soared into the sky, closing the distance between them and the horned eagle archers. Enemy attack! Attack! Amidst a series of anxious shouts, all the horned eagles flapped their wings and started to drift outwards to avoid the attacks of the vampires. While the horned eagles were moving, the elven archers on their backs used their outstanding balance to regain control of their bodies. They drew their bows and quickly intercepted the arrows. Thud, thud, thud. Countless sounds of bowstrings exploding could be heard as arrows after arrows shot toward the blood-colored figures at a speed that was hard to discern with the naked eye. Strangely, These blood-colored figures did not have any intention of dodging the arrows that covered the sky. They charged into the sky against the rain of arrows. Following a series of loud shouts, blood-colored arcs of light filled with violent blood energy streaked across the sky in all directions. The horned eagles that could not dodge in time flapped their wings and let out long cries. In the next second, their corpses were sliced into two, and blood rained down from the sky. As for the elven archers on the backs of the horned eagles, some of them were agile and managed to leave the area enveloped by the blood-colored arcs of light in time, and were saved by the horned eagles nearby. Some of them could not react in time, and their bodies, along with the horned eagles beneath them, were sliced by the blood-colored arcs of light. They did not even have the chance to cry out before they were turned into a pile of flesh and blood falling from the sky. In that moment, the team of horned eagles was in chaos. Taking advantage of their panic, the blood-colored figures flapped their bat wings again, launching a ferocious charge toward them like knights in the sky. The 3 blood knights and 3 blood elves were all powerhouses that possessed pseudo-level 2 abilities. Coupled with the fact that they did not fear the attacks of the elves, they were like tigers that had entered a flock of sheep when they charged. They slaughtered the team of horned eagles until they were beyond miserable, their corpses raining down from the sky. Chirp, chirp. A series of cries of magical beasts came from the distant horizon. Sensing that the scouts in front of them were being attacked, a large group of chimeras and silver pegasi carrying a large number of elves quickly approached the battlefield. Before the reinforcements could enter the battlefield, a whistle sounded from the dense forest below them. The 6 blood-colored figures that were in the midst of battle turned around and quickly entered the dense forest, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. By the time the elves' reinforcements arrived, there was only a group of horned eagles that were circling high up in the sky, as well as pieces of broken bodies hanging from the branches of the dense forest below them. The thick stench of blood rushed straight into their nostrils, choking them to the point of vomiting. The high-grade druids who arrived at the scene stomped their feet in anger. At the same time, they were secretly shocked by the vampire's ferocity. There's a group of fellows with abilities as high as level 2 in the enemy's team. If there's no strong person in the front line, it'll be easy for them to catch us off guard. A superior elf, standing on the back of a majestic chimera, frowned and said, "Sir Antoril, it seems like the heavy responsibility of tracking the enemy can only be left to you." This fellow, called Antoril, was a level 3 druid elder. He belonged to the raptor druid sect and could transform into 2 types of ferocious magical birds with level 3 abilities. That was why he was brought along by the elven commander. In a normal elven army, level 3 combatants usually had an extremely high status and position. Even the elven commander leading the team could not force them to do anything. If there was really a need to use them, they could only talk to them in a negotiating tone. Moreover, this level 3 druid elder in front of them belonged to a certain raptor druid sect and leisurely stood outside of the elven army. So if the elven commander wanted to assign him, he could only rely on his good personal relationship with him. After all, every druid elder would never act alone. Behind this elder Antoril stood a dozen or so high-grade druids covered in green leaves and vines. Among them, there were as many as 4 druid masters, and the rest were some elite druids with individual specializations. Such a strong druid team, in any elven army, would be an elite force that they were afraid to touch and afraid to melt. They would not be sent to the battlefield for no reason. But today, in order to prevent the vampires from escaping, they could only use them as vanguards. "Leave it to us." The druid elder was obviously very familiar with the elven commander. He took charge and said, "These evil fellows have already massacred all the elven villages near the west coast. We also want to find them to settle the score. Let's go. Let's teach them a lesson." Following the druid elder's roar, the 18 druids wearing eagle helmets raised their long staffs at the same time. In a dazzling green light, they quickly transformed into giant eagles or winged flying snakes, and then plunged into the dense forest. As for the druid elder, he quickly transformed into a huge thunder rock, spreading his wings and soaring forward. This thunder rock was huge, and its body was surrounded by lightning. It was simply shocking. With this group of druids leading the way, the safety of the elven archers was finally guaranteed. The hippogriffs that had just been scattered gathered again. Although the number of members was reduced by half, the remaining elven archers were still full of fighting spirit. They all requested the elven commander to continue pursuing the enemy. So, with the approval of the elven commander, the hippogriffs that were left with only 20 or so people flapped their wings and followed closely behind the huge thunder rock, chasing in the direction where the enemy escaped. A few miles behind them, a large group of elven war dancers, archers, and green fairies were shuttling through the dense forest in a loose formation, trying their best to catch up with the flying sentinels. It had to be said that in terms of positional warfare, the vampires were indeed no match for this elven army. However, in terms of mobile warfare, this elven army would not be able to touch the bottom of the vampires' boots, even if they were to expand 10 times. Chapter 681. The forest was deep, and the ancient trees towered into the sky. Inside the dense forest, the sky was cut into wisps by the branches of the tall trees. Mottled light scattered from the sky, flickering with the rustling of the leaves. The endless green forest, from low shrubs to towering giant trees, seemed to be a paradise for plants, a treasure trove of nature. Iron oaks, fir trees, cedars, spruce trees, and other tall trees rose straight up, their majestic and magnificent figures breathtaking. Beneath their feet, there were all kinds of unknown shrubs and vines, densely intertwining the gaps of the forest, airtight. Walking in such a boundless primitive forest, any outsider would find it difficult to move an inch. But at this moment, there were two strange teams in this magical forest, chasing each other and fighting fiercely. In front of them was the vampire army, led by Mary. Although this team was called an army, the total number of people was only about 200, and the number of elite vampires was less than 30. However, it was precisely such a group of rabble that could transform into palm-sized, blood-colored bats. They screeched as they flew between the branches and ancient vines, frantically avoiding the group of ferocious fiends that were chasing after them. There were only a dozen strange and ferocious birds chasing behind the vampire army. Most of them were terrifying giant eagles with golden hooks and iron wings. When they stood upright, they were more than 2 meters tall, and their wingspans were up to 4 meters wide. The rest were some strange flying snakes with wings on their backs. As they flew, their bodies were rolling with dazzling lightning. As large flying birds, their bodies were actually not suitable for flying so fast in the dense forest. But they strangely ignored the forest, sometimes spreading their wings to soar in the sky, and sometimes retracting their wings to leap between the dense branches and leaves. Every time their green eyes locked onto a blood-colored bat that was flapping its wings, a terrifying wind blade or lightning bolt would immediately shoot out. With the strength of the vampire derivative, it was simply too difficult to evade such instantaneous spells. Therefore, along the way, many blood-colored bats were hit in the air and turned into ashes. The few counterattacks that the blood-colored bat organized in a hurry were clearly unable to harm the pursuers at all. Before the swarm of bats could get close to those guys, half of them were killed by the rolling lightning. As a vampire derivative with only the strength of a high-level acolyte, they lacked magic resistance and were as thin as paper in the eyes of an elite druid. As for the blood-sucking regeneration ability, it was completely useless in the face of the dense thunderstorm. Only the Blood Knights and Blood Elves could contend against these pursuers. Even the Tier 1 vampires could not guarantee their own safety. However, under the deterrence of the huge thunder rock above her, Mary hesitated and did not dare to send out an elite team to kill the pursuers behind her. Just like that, the two of them quickly traversed through the dense forest. In just a day, they had already traveled nearly 200 kilometers. At this moment, the power of the unique physique of the vampires gradually came into play. The vampires still had energy to spare, but the druid team was already exhausted. Finally, The pursuers were gradually left behind, and the vampires fled into the depths of the forest while squeaking strangely. After flying at top speed in the forest for another 2 hours, the vampire army only stopped near a low cliff when the druids could no longer be seen. Although the vampires had a unique physique, the continuous exhaustion caused the blood energy stored in their bodies to fall to an extremely low level. At this moment, night had already fallen, and the entire forest was plunged into darkness. After setting up a simple camp here, a large group of vampires scattered into the surrounding forest to search for blood and food. Mary and a group of her subordinates gathered together and quietly discussed their plans for the next few days. It was obvious that they did not dare to set foot in the surroundings of Tianxue City anymore. Their previous reckless behavior had clearly angered the upper echelons of the elves. It was obviously not an accident that this elite elven army could stop them near the west coast. It was a premeditated encirclement and suppression operation by the other party. Mary called out a few blood elves, and after asking them carefully, she had a rough idea of what was going on. In a regular elven army, there was usually an elf prophet next to the elf commander. In addition to being knowledgeable and familiar with the terrain, flora, and fauna of the entire Kalan continent, they were also prophets. Prophets were undoubtedly the most difficult of all spellcasters to deal with, and they were also the type that Mary did not want to face the most. As a Grade 2 vampire wizard, she dared to lead a group of temporarily assembled motley crew to slaughter in the territory of the Elven Kingdom. She relied on the nimbleness and stealth of the team. She did not even dare to touch the overly powerful elven cities and teams. The ones she chose to deal with were all delicacies that could be easily swallowed after careful selection. However, once they were entangled by the elf prophets, the advantage that the vampires had previously had would disappear under their guidance. If they were surrounded by a large group of elves, the team that Mary had painstakingly gathered would vanish in an instant. To put it bluntly, even Mary, a Grade 2 vampire wizard, might not be able to escape unscathed. Just as Mary and the others were discussing in low voices, the angry and urgent roars of the vampires suddenly came from the distant forest. What's going on? What happened there? Mary suddenly stood up, and her scarlet eyes shone in the darkness. Just at that moment, she sensed that another 4 mental nodes had lost their connection to her origin. It seemed like they had been killed by someone. Suddenly, there was a buzzing sound in the distant forest, and dozens of blood-colored bats swarmed out. They screeched and quickly circled around, as if they were avoiding something. Just as Mary was puzzled, the sound of bowstrings exploding could be heard. Strange crossbow bolts shot out from the forest and nailed a dozen or so vampire bats to the ancient trees. It's the elves. Almost instantly, Mary and the others realized who the enemy was. Although they were very surprised that the elves could catch up with them so quickly, Mary still led the group of Grade 2 subordinates into the forest. The magic forest was still so mysterious under the night sky. During the day, the magic forest was dark and gloomy, but at night, the magic forest emitted a faint fluorescence because of the many glimmering moss and magic plants. This faint light was not enough to illuminate the forest for ordinary people, but for Mary and the others, it was enough for them to see as if it was daytime. In a vast and deep magic forest, everything was so quiet and deep. Everything was so peaceful and tranquil. Looking around, Mary could not help but frown. Where was the enemy? Where was the enemy? In her blood-red vision, she could not see any living creatures, let alone those elven archers. Those arrows were shot from here. How could they escape so quickly? Just as Mary was thinking about it, there was a sudden sound of wind breaking in the shadows of the magic forest. A large number of accurate and ruthless arrows shot out, and they were all caught in it. The blood elves and the old fox Venlier were inexperienced, and they could not help but let out low groans when the arrows pierced into their bodies. The 3 blood knights drew their swords and blocked most of the arrows. Occasionally, there were a few that entered their bodies, but they endured it without batting an eyelid. On the other hand, Mary stretched out her snow-white, slender fingernails that were smeared with gorgeous daffodil juice and flicked her fingers, deflecting all the arrows that were aimed at her. The way he lifted something heavy, as if it was light, shocked those who were hiding in the dark. Shadows floated, and their figures became illusory. The arrows only flickered for a moment, and the figures that were still vivid in their eyes disappeared again. The three blood knights dashed there with their long swords and chopped countless rose branches and thorns, but strangely, they did not find the enemy. Invisible enemies? Just as they were inexplicably shocked, dozens of arrows were shot again from extremely close range. This time, they were not so lucky to use their swords to block, and were instantly shot like porcupines by the concentrated arrows. Mary's gaze froze. This time, she could clearly see that the crossbow bolts were shot right at the bodies of the three blood paladins. It was as if they were standing in the middle of a group of invisible elves, but they did not see them at all. The arrows were made of fine steel, and there were some exquisite magic patterns etched on them. They seemed to have two special effects, penetration and wind wings. The former was used to kill those wearing heavy armor or hard skin, and the latter was purely used to eliminate the sound of arrows breaking through the air. That was why the arrows that pierced the bodies of the three blood knights were enchanted arrows. A person who could afford to use such an expensive enchanted arrow was obviously not an ordinary person. Even though they were pierced by 7 or 8 crossbow bolts, the three blood knights were still swinging their swords with vigor and vigor. Streams of blood-red sword energy surged out of their blades, chopping down the ancient trees and shrubs around them. Tree branches were chopped off. In the midst of the huge chaos, a slender figure leaped down from the fallen tree trunk, rolled a few times on the ground, and disappeared into the shadows of another tree. In the next moment, Mary was already at the place where the figure disappeared, and her scarlet eyes flashed with a strange light as she looked around. Behind her, a dark dagger poked out of the shadows and silently stabbed towards the back of Mary's head. The moonlight shone through the lush leaves and branches, casting a mottled shadow that perfectly concealed the magical aura at the edge of the dagger. Screech! The moment the dagger was about to touch the skin, the tip of the dagger suddenly exploded with power. Chapter 682. It was like a well-coordinated performance. Mary, who was coldly looking around, suddenly twisted her body and perfectly dodged the explosive power of the mysterious dagger. She then mysteriously appeared in the shadows. At the same time, she used her finger as a knife and lightly stabbed into a fresh body. After a painful groan, warm, bright red blood flowed out from the cracked and withered bark in front of him. At the same time, a soft sound was heard, and a graceful human figure peeled off from the bark. As the elf's cloak parted, the female elf's iconic delicate face was revealed. Although the face was extremely distorted due to the pain, it was still so beautiful. It even gave people a strange feeling of pity and regret. Mary's right hand, that was soaked with a large amount of blood energy, had completely sunk into the elf's chest and was gently holding onto the beautiful beating heart. "Don't worry about me. Kill this demon." The injured elf screamed with all her might as blood dripped from the corner of her mouth. In the surrounding shadows of the dense forest, the faint sound of bowstrings being pulled could be heard. Enchanted crossbow bolts shot towards Mary from all directions. However, no matter how fast the crossbow bolts were, how could they compare to Mary's super high agility? After advancing to the second level, Mary's agility had reached an astonishing 26 points, which was 2 times that of the strange elves in front of her. High agility not only gave Mary an astonishing jumping ability and lightning-fast movement speed, but also a shocking reaction speed. To put it bluntly, in Mary's field of vision, everything was slow and even static. As long as she willed it, she could easily stab a dagger into the elf's heart when he drew his bow and angrily shot at her. Then, she would leisurely return to her original position and slowly wait for the arrows to fly towards her. After advancing to the second level, Mary rarely used her blood-red longbow. It wasn't because the power was too weak, but because the speed of the crossbow bolts was too slow. Rather than waiting for the crossbow bolts to fly to the enemy's body, it would be more refreshing and direct to directly stab the enemy's heart or throat with a bloody hand. Therefore, in the face of the concentrated crossbow bolts, Mary still had the leisure to crush the heart of the elf before her, before strolling leisurely in the rain of arrows. She reached out her hand and brushed aside a few arrows that were in her way. She took a big stride and appeared in front of an impenetrable bush and brambles 10 meters away. Her sharp fingernails that were smeared with alluring daffodil juice gently scratched the throat of a transparent human figure. Only then did she teleport away again. However, in the eyes of those strange elves, Mary's actions were as evil as a ghost's. A moment ago, Mary was standing next to an old tree 20 to 30 meters away. The next second, she appeared next to one of her companions and slashed her throat. The next second, she appeared in another area and shot an arrow of blood into the eye of another elf. Teleport, disappear, teleport, disappear, teleport again. It was impossible to capture the process and movements in the middle. The only thing the elves could capture with their slow dynamic vision was the slight pause before Mary killed the person. Therefore, when the impenetrable rain of arrows pierced the old tree, 6 fountains of blood sprayed out from the void, illuminated by the moonlight in the dense forest. Without a sound, the 6 elves, who had their eyes wide open and were filled with disbelief and fear, abruptly collapsed. Their delicate bodies tumbled onto the verdant forest grass. Due to the death of their original bodies, the elven cloaks covering the elves' bodies also lost their moonlit night invisibility. Finally, their strange side was revealed in front of the vampires. All of them wore the same exquisite soft armor and dark green cloaks. All of them had the same exquisite face and slender ears. All of them had the same green short hair and a small and exquisite crossbow. In addition, there were daggers, flying claws, and throwing knives at their waists. They were all dressed like assassins. Could the elves also have assassins? Just when she was in a trance, a whistling sound came from the forest again. A swift cold wind attacked Mary's back from the side. The cold wind was sharp and cold, as if it was a small, sharp weapon. The shadows in the forest shook violently again. Illusory shadows flashed everywhere in the magic forest, and a series of metal clashing sounds lingered in the ears. The one who came was obviously a grade 2 fighter among the exotic elves. She was also a high-agility assassin, and with a psychedelic body blessed by the moonlight goddess, ordinary people's vision could only capture the afterimages left by her. With such a cheap and practical ability and her high agility, outsiders could not even touch the corner of her clothes before dying under her incomparably sharp dagger. Pity, it was really a pity. The exotic elf's 21 points of agility met Mary's 26 points of agility, which directly caused her to be unable to catch up with Mary's figure. Mary also seemed to have the ability to distinguish between the real body and the illusion of the elves, which directly caused all the killing moves of the exotic elves to become illusory bubbles in front of Mary. The two quickly shuttled through the dense forest, and in less than 10 seconds, they had almost changed the battlefield 20 to 30 times. The result of the battle was that Mary was unharmed, while the exotic elf had 7 claw marks on her body, one of which fiercely slashed through the delicate and beautiful right side of her face. Moreover, when the two fiercely exchanged a move and separated in the dense forest, 3 invisible elves silently fell. Without exception, their hearts and throats were pierced with bloody holes, and the gurgling blood dyed the grass below them red. Flashing into the shadows of the forest, the exotic elf's eyes were burning with anger. She stared at the female vampire at the top of the ancient tree, who was leisurely stepping on a soft branch, her slender figure sinking and sinking. Although her heart was full of unwillingness and anger, she clearly understood that the difference in strength between the two sides was too big, to the point that it could not be made up for with numbers. The opponent was grade 2, and she was also grade 2. But there was also a world of difference between grade 2. After all, the opponent was a Grade 2 witch from the Sorcerer World, and she was only a Grade 2 experimental unit created by the Moonlight Temple and the Elven Kingdom. Whether it was the basic physical data of the two sides or the performance of their individual abilities, they were not on the same technical level. If the opponent was said to be a ferocious lone wolf covered with scars and experienced countless bloody battles, then she was said to be a white rabbit armed to the extreme. Even if they wore a full set of armor, even if they had sharp weapons, when they fought together, the lone wolf would always be the one to survive. There was no reason, no certainty. One was a natural predator, while the other was a herbivore that bared its fangs and brandished its claws to scare away the enemy. Almost from the moment they were born, the positions of the two sides were already determined, and it was difficult to change it with external help. After a moment of confrontation, the anger in the eyes of the exotic elf leader gradually faded. Full of unwillingness, she admitted the fact of defeat and silently gave the order to retreat. With a whistle, the exotic elves hiding everywhere in the dense forest immediately fled in all directions. Their invisibility had been broken by the enemy, and coupled with the frightening movement speed of the enemy leader, if they persisted, they would only end up being annihilated. Thus, the dense forest that had been quiet and empty a moment ago was immediately filled with figures. Countless illusory shadows floated in the forest, dazzling the eyes. The three Blood Knights gripped their runic swords tightly, ready to give chase, but were stunned by the scene in front of them. For a moment, they did not know where they should go. They could only stay where they were, silently listening to the mournful screams that rang out one after another in the forest. Then, the forest became deathly silent. Just as they were confused, Mary leisurely walked out from the shadow of an ancient tree, her hands hanging low, sweet and sticky blood dripping from them. When the exotic elf leader wanted to retreat, even if Mary attacked with all her might, it would be difficult to stop her. So, she did not waste too much time on the leader, and chose to quickly slaughter the other elves. Obviously, she had gained a lot. Go and collect the elves' corpses. I want to examine them again. With that, Mary proudly walked back to the temporary camp. The power of the Blood Queen was on full display at this moment. After a while, 23 elven corpses were lined up in the middle of the temporary camp, examined by a few high-level vampires. Finally, after listening to the feedback from the Blood Elves, Old Fox Venlier returned to Mary's side and reported in a low voice. "Serene Moon Assassins, what the hell was this?" Mary waved her hand and called the Blood Elves over, asking them in detail again. Only then did she understand the information about this exotic elf troop. Of course, this was a defensive force that belonged to the Moonlight Shrine. The Elven Kingdom had chosen outstanding elven rangers to enter the Moonlight Shrine and become devout believers of the Moonlight Goddess. Then, with the blessing of the goddess, they had created this completely exotic elf troop, the Serene Moon Assassins. Using this method, they had made up for the Elven Kingdom's lack of top-notch assassins. The Serene Moon Assassins had exquisite individual skills. Whether it was the traditional elven archery skills or close combat abilities, they were all top-notch in the Faerun Plane. In addition to the moonlight invisibility and moon shadow doppelganger that the Moonlight Goddess had bestowed upon them, the Serene Moon Assassins had the basic ability to become top-notch assassins in the Faerun Plane. The only thing they lacked was actual combat ability and the sharpening of their will to fight. The debut of the Serene Moon Assassins was undoubtedly a mess, because they had chosen a terrifying hell difficulty opponent, the Blood Queen Mary. Although the rank 2 Serene Moon Assassin leader was of the same rank as Mary, she was completely defeated in terms of individual combat skills and God-given abilities. Chapter 683. After all, the Sorcerer World was one of the few large planes in the multiverse. The sorcerers who came from the Sorcerer World were much stronger than the powerhouses of the same rank in other worlds. Mary and the Serene Moon Assassin leader were both Tier 2, but Mary had an overwhelming advantage in a fight. If the Serene Moon Assassin leader chose to fight to the death, Mary would only need to pay the price of minor injuries to kill him. After this battle, the higher-ups of the elves behind the scenes would understand that in order to suppress Mary, they would need to send a team of Tier 2 professionals or a Tier 3 powerhouse. Currently, the number of Tier 4 powerhouses in the Elven Kingdom could be counted on one hand. They were usually worshipped as the kingdom's stabilizing weapon, so as not to disturb the elves. The Tier 3 powerhouses active in the Callan continent were actually the core of the Elven Kingdom. They were the most common basic combat power. If a random which had to be dealt with by a Tier 3 powerhouse, then with the current reserves of Tier 3 powerhouses in the Elven Kingdom, it would be impossible to deal with the witch calamity that would last for a long time. Take Skywater City, the closest city to Mary, for example. There was not a single Tier 4 powerhouse there, and the highest combat power, there was only 5 Tier 3 elves. Aijia, the Spear of Vengeance wandering among the people, was lured to Greenwater City by the insect Lich Bliss. This meant that the number of Tier 3 elves in Skywater City had dropped to 4. The fact that they were willing to send a Tier 3 Druid Elder to kill Mary showed that the higher-ups of the elves could no longer tolerate these vampires and were determined to eradicate them. As for the Serene Moon Assassin team that appeared out of nowhere, it could only be an impulsive move by the elven leader. Of course, it was more likely that the higher-ups of the elves were trying to test the effectiveness of the Serene Moon Assassin team. To be honest, if they had not encountered Mary, the Serene Moon Assassin team would have performed very well. Even someone as powerful as the Blood Esquire had been repeatedly defeated by them. From this, it could be seen how powerful their moonlit night concealment was. At this point, old Fox Venlier could not help but ask in surprise, "Master, how did you manage to find those Serene Moon Assassins?" Mary's expression turned cold. "Humph, you've been with me for so long, but you still can't get rid of your human habits. We are now the Blood Clan, a noble race with long lifespans. Why don't we make good use of our excellent blood-sensing ability? The elves' cloaks can only provide simple environmental camouflage. Their innate talent, moonlit invisibility, is to use the moonlight to hide themselves. These two abilities may be able to deceive the eyes and conceal body temperature, but they cannot hide the smell of blood. In the past, you focused too much on the assistance of blood energy to your own combat strength, but you've neglected the power of blood energy itself. Have any of you specially researched and improved a relatively unorthodox ability like blood perception? Right now, you might not be interested in the insignificant auxiliary effects of blood perception, but you can't do anything about it. Blood. SUU. Clans usual blood. Blood. You all to the clans of the blood, the blood, come on blood, the blood, or you will never. As the Blood Queen, Mary rarely gave her subordinates a stern warning. At this moment, this solemn warning was clearly the greatest harvest and insight she had gained after advancing to Tier 2. Blood Clan, what was most important? At the end of the day, it was still the vampire's control of blood. Without this control, they would become a group of monsters and beasts that lived by blood. They would no longer be the noble Blood Clan that stood above all others. In response to Mary's stern warning, the vampires around her could only bow their heads and obey her orders. Only high-ranking vampires like the Blood Knights and Blood Elves could rely on their own intelligence to think silently and remember it firmly in their hearts. Go, enjoy the feast of your blood. Remember, you only have a quarter of an hour. After that, we will continue our journey. The direction is the north. After warning her subordinates, Mary raised her hands and announced to the vampires that they were going to eat. The vampires immediately became restless. All the Grade 1 vampires cheered and rushed to the corpses of the elves in the middle of the camp. They crawled on their bodies and sucked the blood that had yet to coagulate. The low-level vampires, on the other hand, could not enjoy such treatment. They could only leap up and transform into blood-colored bats. They gathered into a red cloud and squeaked as they dove into the surrounding forest. There were countless wild beasts waiting for them to hunt and kill. Although the blood of wild beasts was inferior and smelly compared to the blood of intelligent species, It was enough to replenish their stamina and energy. As for the three blood knights, the three blood elves, and the old fox, Vinlier, they naturally had servants to serve them the warm, fresh blood that they had just squeezed out. They did not have to act like ordinary vampires, which was similar to wild beast eating. As for a blood queen like Mary, she couldn't even be bothered with pure blood anymore. She only wanted to taste the blood crystal. It was a strange crystal formed by purifying a large amount of blood. The blood crystal was not big, usually only the size of a thumb. However, even a thumb-sized blood crystal would require the blood of 3 adult elves to be extracted. In order to increase the taste and energy saturation, Mary would try her best to choose elves who were warriors. After leading a large group of vampires to sweep the entire West Coast, Mary had 12 sparkling blood crystals in her pouch. On the elven battlefield, if her strength was greatly depleted and she could not find a suitable way to replenish it, any blood crystal would allow her to quickly recover to her peak state. This was the most important strategic resource that she had prepared for herself. Due to the heavy fog in the forest, the morning in the illusory forest came slightly late. When the sun in the distance cast its first ray of light through the hazy fog, a large group of druids and elves had already arrived at the camp of the vampires. Without a doubt, they found the corpses of their elven companions piled up into a pile. The equipment and clothes on the elves' corpses had been taken away. Not even a single piece of cloth was left for them. On the corpses that were piled up in all sorts of strange positions, bloody bite marks could be seen everywhere. Large and small teeth marks were all over their withered and wrinkled red mantis fruit bodies. Apart from the corpses of the elves, there were also the remains of many gorillas, hyenas, porcupines, and other large beasts around the camp. Without exception, they had all been sucked dry of their blood. Their shriveled and wrinkled skin was a ghastly sight to behold. These damned evildoers! We must exterminate these witches. We must avenge them. All the elves turned their faces slightly, no longer willing to see the miserable and horrifying state of their fellow elves. Curses accompanied by soft sobs slowly sounded in the forest. All right, we already know how evil the witches are. We will mourn our fallen comrades later. The most important thing now is to continue tracking the enemy's whereabouts. Master Kimball, we will have to trouble you. The elven commander with a mournful expression stood up and comforted the elves. Only then did he invite the respected elven prophet behind him. It had to be said that even in the Fairn Plain, the elven prophet was one of the hardest to advance into. The female elven prophet, Master Kimball, was only a grade 1, but her body was already hunched at a 90-degree angle. The wrinkles on her wrinkled face were so dense that even a mosquito would have a hard time landing on it. To be honest, standing in the midst of a group of tall and beautiful elves, the old and ugly appearance of this elven prophet made it hard for one to look straight at her. The grade 2 elf standing next to the elven prophet was dressed in exquisite soft armor made from magical beasts, with a dark green elven cloak draped over her back. The belt on the left side of her waist was densely packed with shining daggers and throwing knives, while the right side of her waist was slung with exquisite craftsmanship and unique design. She was tall and slender, but there was a terrifying claw mark on the right side of her beautiful and perfect face, almost completely disfiguring her. Fortunately, with the help of potions and nature spells, the claw mark was already slowly closing, forming a scab and healing. Perhaps it would be completely healed in half an hour. As the leader of Yuyue's assassin squad, seeing her companions and old acquaintances reduced to such a miserable state, Natasha's heart was filled with grief, indignation, and pain that could not be understood by outsiders. Due to the rash attack last night, Natasha had been temporarily relieved of her position as the leader of the assassins. She could only temporarily serve as the elven prophet, Master Kimball's personal guard. Although Master Kimball was an elven prophet, it was impossible for her to predict the whereabouts of the vampires. Therefore, if they wanted to find out where the vampires went, they could only rely on the vampires' food residue. Under the watchful eyes of the many elves and druids, The hunchbacked old master, Kimball, slowly walked to the horrifying pile of corpses, leaning on a nature staff that was 2 heads taller than herself. But just as she softly chanted a strange incantation that was difficult for outsiders to comprehend, the horrifying pile of corpses suddenly exploded with a violent and ferocious blood-red energy. In the next second, severed limbs flew, and the blood-red mist churned. Chapter 684. It had to be said that in terms of killing techniques and underhanded tactics, the elves before them were as pure as a bunch of little white rabbits who had never experienced the world. No matter how vicious and cunning they imagined the enemy to be, when it came to fighting witches who had come from another world, they were still beaten to the point of vomiting blood by the endless plots and schemes of the other party. At this moment, it was obvious that the elves had the advantage in terms of numbers and strength. They were definitely the hunters. On the other hand, the vampires, who numbered no more than 200, were the complete prey. They should be thinking about how to avoid the elves' pursuit. It was impossible, and they should not have the guts to turn back and bite the elves. Unfortunately, this group of vampires just had to do the opposite. They actually hid most of their elites in the pile of elven corpses, waiting for the fish to bite the bait. And this fish was the crow Beak, who could bring great disaster to the vampires, the Tier 2 elven prophet, Master Kimball. As the pile of corpses exploded, a thick mist of blood instantly filled the area, plunging everything within a radius of tens of meters into darkness. Meanwhile, the vampire bats were like a swarm of headless flies flying around, attacking every elf in the vicinity in a frenzy. But what was strange was that not a single bat broke into the elven prophet's side. If the enemy had planned this attack, how could they have missed a big shot like the elven prophet? Master Kimball knew the situation was bad. She quickly retreated while continuously waving the nature staff in her hand. Rays of green light swirled around her body, and dense protective spells such as Armor of Thorns, Nature's Barrier, Tree Skin, and Nature's Guard quickly surrounded her. The dazzling light from the spells was so bright that it was almost impossible to open one's eyes. As an elven prophet, even though he had lost most of his spellcasting abilities, he was still able to use his instant cast staff, magic items, magic scrolls, and magic potions to buff himself with the most magic protection in the shortest time possible. Only when he was under such a tight magical protection did Master Kimball's heart calm down a little. She took out a powerful magic scroll from her waist, narrowed her eyes, and carefully waited for the enemy's attack. She also had sufficient self-awareness, knowing that with her 6 points of agility, it was impossible for her to escape the enemy's attack range. Therefore, she simply protected herself tightly and waited for her companions to rescue her. Among the elves present today, there were 21 Tier 2 fighters and a Tier 3 Elder Druid. Just as the gears in Kimball's head were turning, a ghostly figure appeared in the thick blood mist and clung tightly to the outermost layer of the thorny armor. As the green ripple spread, the 2 people in the arena groaned at the same time. As a Tier 2 vampire sorcerer, Mary's attacks were a combination of blood energy and shadow energy. With 5 physical attacks per second, she could deal terrifying damage in the shortest amount of time. In particular, the blood energy was extremely corrosive and was adept at breaking through magical defenses, while the shadow energy had the property of ignoring defenses. It was a basic skill that a magic assassin must master. Therefore, in just a few seconds, Mary broke through nearly 60% of Master Kimball's magical defenses with her compound attack. At the same time, the shadow energy that penetrated her body also made Kimball cough up blood. However, the thorny armor that the female prophet placed on herself also had the property of reflecting 30% physical damage. So while Mary quickly attacked her opponent, the blood in her body was also surging, and the damage was endless. In just a few seconds, the elves and druids had enough time to react. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. A large area of natural light exploded continuously in the arena. The elves and druids were all nature-type creatures, so naturally, they would not be hurt by this natural light. Only Mary and her vampire bats were not nature-type creatures, so the humanoid vampires all raised their heads and shrieked in agony. In an instant, they were purified by the dense bursts of green light. The druids were all on the periphery, so it was difficult for them to rush over. However, they casually cast recovery spells such as rejuvenation, protection from evil, heal damage, and other healing spells on Master Kimball. In an instant, the little bit of damage she had just suffered disappeared without a trace, and her condition was at its peak. One by one, the druids roared and charged forward. Some turned into violent giant bears, shaking the ground as they charged forward. Some turned into huge eagles, letting out a long cry as they soared into the sky. Some turned into vigorous cheetahs, and with a single leap, they suddenly disappeared in the air. The rank 3 elder druid did not expect a little rank 2, which to be so bold as to choose to assassinate the elven prophet right in front of his eyes. Therefore, at this moment, his entire dark green face was flushed with anger. As he ran with large strides, he waved the oak staff in his hand with all his might. Above the clearing in the forest, a thunderstorm the size of an acre quickly formed. Bolts of lightning as thick as the mouth of a bowl struck down from the rolling thunderclouds, heading straight for the bloody figure that was madly chasing the elven prophet. The serene moon assassin leader, who was already fully prepared, regretfully appeared at the edge of the thunderclouds. Originally, she wanted to use her speed to pin down the vampire witch. Unfortunately, the Tier 3 thunderstorm had blocked her from doing so. These bolts of lightning did not distinguish between friend and foe. Once she rushed in, she would also be attacked by the thunderclouds. With no other choice, Natasha turned around and dashed towards the vampires scattered around the periphery to prevent the elves from coming to the rescue. With her strength of rank 2, dealing with these vampire minions that were only at the level of a senior apprentice was basically a piece of cake. It was exceptionally easy for her to kill them. In such a difficult situation, anyone would think that the vampire which would temporarily retreat, avoiding the wave of natural spells before assassinating the elven prophet. However, to their surprise, the vampire which did not retreat at all. She forcefully withstood the violent thunderclouds and the pouring natural spells, completely sticking to the elven prophet's protective shield, and attacked with all her might. The wild thunderclouds that descended from the sky were reduced by half by the bloody mist that permeated everywhere, but the remaining violent magic energy still electrified half of Mary's body into a piece of charcoal. Although Mary had tried her best to dodge the dense raindrops of thorns, elven fire, poison strike, star fire, but the space to dodge was limited. She was still beaten to the point of vomiting blood, and her broken body almost collapsed. The elven prophet who was hiding behind the layers of protection was still fine, but the hunter was already dying. However, the elven prophet's protective shield was only left with a thin layer. Just when the elves were slightly relieved and were ready to make another wave of efforts to take the abominable vampire witch away, she actually took out a shiny, bloody crystal and stuffed it into her mouth. In the next second, the bloody energy in her body violently surged out, and in an instant, a layer of thick and terrible blood-like mist was instantly formed around her body. At the same time, her own life aura rose once again. Damn it! Damn it! At this moment, the striding grade 3 druid elder realized that although his large-scale thunderstorm had caused great damage to the vampire witch, it had also indirectly hindered the rescue of the elves on his side. Under his violent roar, the surging thunderclouds instantly disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the druids gathered at the edge of the thunderstorm, swarmed up, and suddenly pounced into the thick bloody mist that was difficult to see. Natasha, who was the fastest in the field, also quickly got rid of the vampire's entanglement and pounced into the bloody mist. Amidst the noisy shouts, roars, and roars, an almost undetectable sound of a shield breaking was so shocking. The mist shook. The elven prophet Kimball ignored her own old age and ran wildly. Her body had just rushed out of the edge of the mist and was about to ask for help from Natasha, who was close at hand. but an extremely sharp blood arrow pierced through the back of her head and flew out from the middle of her forehead. The blood energy carried by the blood arrow directly eroded the prophet's entire brain. With a loud bang, the prophet's head exploded, and a fountain of blood soared more than 3 meters into the sky, drenching the surrounding elves and druids. Natasha roared angrily and rushed into the bloody mist. At this time, there were as many as 11 Grade 2 elves in the bloody mist. The other Grade 2 elves were guarding the periphery of the bloody mist, constantly spreading light of nature to purify the blood energy. But to their surprise, this thick layer of bloody mist seemed to be constantly replenished. So many elves casting spells at the same time, but they still couldn't quickly purify it. Natasha and the druids who had entered the bloody mist seemed to have fallen into a terrible blood swamp. No matter how hard they struggled and ran, their speed was inevitably limited to an extremely low level. That fierce vampire which had countless incarnations, and at this moment, she was fighting with almost everyone at the same time. Groans of pain, sounds of claws scratching and stabbing flesh, sounds of blood splattering, and loud roars of anger. "Open for me!" Elder Antoril, who rushed to the front of the bloody mist, roared, and a huge green halo instantly smashed into the bloody mist. Chapter 685. With just one attack, Mary's body was severely injured. If it wasn't for the blood crystals she had swallowed earlier, which were being converted into blood energy to support her body, she would have died on the spot the moment she was attacked. The vengeful attack of a Grade 3 Elder Druid was not something a Grade 2 vampire sorcerer like her could easily withstand. Taking advantage of Mary's sluggish state, Natasha and a few other druids swarmed her, using daggers, bare paws, and sharp claws to deal terrifying damage to Mary's body. Mary let out a shrill cry and retracted the blood mist. Her badly mutilated body flashed a few times and escaped the enemy's encirclement. However, facing the Grade 3 Elder Druid who was eyeing her like a tiger watching its prey, Mary did not dare to rush out. As long as she escaped the battle, the old man with fluttering beard would definitely give her another violent attack. With her current physique and spiritual force, even with the blood crystals, she might not be able to withstand it. "Hurry! Hurry up and pull me away!" Mary roared in her soul as she dodged the attacks of multiple enemies. Meanwhile, in a quiet clearing in a forest 100 miles away, 3 blood knights and 3 blood elves were sitting cross-legged in a strange hexagram runic magic circle. Each of them occupied a rune node, and were doing their best to pour blood energy into the mysterious blood pool in the center of the magic circle. As for the old fox Venlier, he could only rub his hands anxiously as he paced back and forth outside the magic circle. "It's been so long. Why hasn't Master sent a signal? It's been so long. It's time to send a signal." Just as he was feeling agitated, he suddenly stopped in his tracks and shouted at the few people inside the magic circle, "Quick! Quick! Master's situation is not good." With the input of the 6 Grade 2 blood breeds, the strange blood pool that was originally only a meter in size suddenly expanded rapidly, swallowing the 6 people and the entire magic circle in an instant. Blood energy filled the air, and the blood mist was so thick that one could not even see their own fingers. The expansion of the blood pool only lasted for half a finger before it shrank back to its original size. In the hazy blood mist, Mary's injured body strangely appeared from the magic circle. The moment Mary's body appeared, her right leg exploded into a mist of blood under the impact of a mysterious force. On the other hand, Mary seemed to be completely unaware of this, and her tightly closed eyes suddenly opened to reveal a pair of ferocious blood-red pupils that were scarlet like blood. "Let's hurry and leave. We can't stay here any longer. The elves will soon chase after us based on the energy fluctuations." Mary calmly sat up and frantically absorbed the energy from the blood pool to repair her damaged body. On the other hand, the old cunning fox courteously rushed to her side and gently helped Mary up. In just a few seconds, Mary's broken right leg had regrown under the nourishment of the blood mist. The regenerated skin was pink and supple, so pink that it looked as if water could be squeezed out with a light pinch. However, as the redness faded, her slender and beautiful thighs regained their fair and translucent luster. The lines were so perfect that it was breathtaking. However, everyone present was Mary's subordinates, and they were filled with deep reverence for this willful and casual mistress. Thus, no one dared to point fingers at her body. Mary shook off Venlier and took the lead to transform into a giant blood-red bat, flying towards the depths of the forest. When the crimson armor flipped over again, Mary gently shook off Wendler. She took the lead and transformed into a giant crimson bat, flying into the depths of the forest at high speed. Behind her, the 3 blood knights, 3 blood elves, the old fox Venlier, and less than 30 vampires rose into the air and flew towards the north. Mary walked with ease, but the elves were already in a mess. Despite having a Tier 3 Druid Elder and over 20 Tier 2 combatants with them, that despicable vampire, which had still managed to slay the noble elven prophet amidst an army of thousands and escape unscathed. Furthermore, the way she left was rather strange. During the bloody battle, complicated and mysterious blood-red patterns suddenly appeared all over her body. Then, she disappeared in a strange pool of blood. The entire process took less than 3 seconds, and the way she left was unheard of. It seemed to be a method unique to otherworld wizards. When the elves couldn't find Mary's whereabouts, they surrounded the headless body of the elven prophet Kimball and fell silent. Although they already knew that these mysterious sorcerers who came from other worlds all had strange and extraordinary abilities, seeing them with their own eyes was still better than hearing about it. Today, after experiencing it for themselves, they trembled in fear as they realized that the difference in power between the two sides was just too great. When they thought about how this was just an ordinary Grade 2 witch, and how there were Grade 3 and terrifying Grade 4 witches above her, all the elves felt a chill in their hearts. For the first time, they felt that the burden on their shoulders was so heavy, and for the first time, they felt that they couldn't bear it. The witch calamity this time seemed to be exceptionally difficult to endure. All the elves couldn't help but have this strange thought in their minds. The behavior of the elves also made Antoril, who was sitting among them, ashamed and angry. He took a step forward, and the huge sound wave was like a thunderclap in the sky. You guys lead the team back to Sky Water City. I'll go after these villains alone. After saying that, without waiting for the elf commander's reply, he transformed into the huge Thunder Rock. With a slight flap of his wings, violent rolling lightning flowed wantonly on his body. With an ear-piercing sound of thunder and lightning, the huge Thunder Rock disappeared on the spot and appeared at the end of the sky. However, before the elves could catch up to the figure of the Thunder Rock, after a new explosion of thunder, the huge Thunder Rock completely disappeared from everyone's sight. All that was left in the sky was a rumbling thunderclap that lasted for a long time. It seemed that Elder Antoril was completely enraged by the vampire witches. He actually shook off all the elves who were in his way and went after them alone. With the speed of his Thunder Rock transformation, it would be difficult for those vampires to escape the pursuit of a Grade 3 druid, even if they had 2 more wings. However, the vast and boundless magic forest was so vast and lush, and it was not an easy task to find the whereabouts of those vampires. The elf commander hesitated for a moment. She also knew that it was wishful thinking for the elves to chase those vampires on the ground. Hence, she left a flying team of less than 30 to 50 people to continue chasing the enemies. She brought the remaining elves and the corpses of the elves who died in battle and set foot on the road back sadly. Grimm only received the intelligence from both sides later. Bugwitch Bliss was being chased around Greenwater City by Spear of Vengeance AIGIA. Although there was no need to worry about him for now, there would be accidents in the long run. On the other hand, Mary was fleeing madly to the north of the magic forest with the remaining Blood Clan elites. Behind them, the terrifying Grade 3 Druid Elder was also in hot pursuit. He had almost found Mary and the others several times. If Mary hadn't sent out the bait in time, they would have been intercepted by the Druid Elder. As the patriarch of the Crimson family, Grimm had to think about how to rescue them when two of his generals were in danger at the same time. When Grimm brought the two intelligence reports to Alice, who had been urging him not to act rashly, nodded and agreed. Grimm looked at the smug Alice in surprise. He couldn't help but ask, "Didn't you say that we're being targeted by the two elven goddesses? Why didn't you stop me this time?" Alice snappily said, "Can you stop me if I stop you?" Grimm hesitated for a moment and shook his head. Times are different now. This time, Mary seems to have made a big mess. If I don't go, it will be difficult for them to escape the grade 3 Druid's pursuit. So I have to go. Since this rescue mission is imperative, why should I stop you? This time we are going all out. No matter what, it's much safer than you going into the Callan continent alone. Alice explained with a smile. Although Alice's words were reasonable, Grimm felt that she was not sincere when he saw her smiling face. However, after spending so much time with her, he had a deep understanding of Alice. Since she chose not to tell him the truth, she must have a good reason. Maybe it was not the right time, or maybe it was the power of fate. In short, he only needed to know that she would not harm him. After understanding this, Grimm didn't ask any more questions. After exchanging some opinions with Alice, he hurriedly went to arrange for the airship to set sail. After Grimm left, Alice let out a sigh of relief. You really don't want to tell him that the dragons are also involved in this war. If you go into the Callan continent with him, the chance of you dying is as high as 80%. In the darkness, a cold and clear voice sounded faintly, but it was immediately covered by a rough and deep female voice. What's there to be afraid of? If the enemy comes, we'll fight them back. Don't tell me that after becoming a Destiny Witch, you're going to wait until you're 100% confident before doing anything. Along with the voice, Alice's two remaining assistants, Sophia, the Berserk Witch, and Chef, the Ice Witch, appeared. As for the remaining Destiny Witch, she had only been promoted for 7 years and was not yet qualified to participate in these secret meetings. Fight. All you know is to fight. Do you know what we will encounter in the Callan continent this time? Isn't it just a group of stinky flying lizards and a group of annoying children of nature? Seeing the Berserk Witch Sophia's indifferent face, Chef could not help but sigh again. That is a group of terrifying dragons that are as high as grade 2 and 3. Even the weakest green dragon is more than enough to swallow you whole. And the highest grade among them is the grade 3 Emerald Dragon, which is more than enough to annihilate our entire team. So what? Just because the enemy is strong, should we just let ourselves be? Don't forget, our only mission this time is to help Alice obtain the Scepter of Prophecy and try to advance to grade 2. As long as we can complete this mission, we can sacrifice and abandon irrelevant people and things. Sophia was still shouting nonchalantly. Although her words were crude, the meaning behind her words was not wrong at all. Chapter 686. Alice shook her head and sighed helplessly at the two deputies who were arguing endlessly. This is actually the true portrayal of the life of the Witches of Destiny. Chasing destiny, gathering the power of destiny. Where will the power of destiny be produced? Of course, it's the place where the conflicts between the planes are the most intense. And almost all of the Witches of Destiny are weak and powerless believers of destiny. Without any protection, they pass through the turbulent valleys and peaks of the waves, and any wave that comes can crush us to pieces. And at this time, what can we rely on? Of course, it's the power of destiny that we believe in. Since destiny has led us here, it will definitely not let us walk the path to our own death. Here, in this treacherous world filled with powerful beings like wolves and wolves, there will definitely be a path left for us to walk on. And the only way to guide us on this path is our faith in destiny. When destiny guides us forward, even if it's a mountain of blades or a sea of fire, even if it's a bottomless abyss, we must not change our expressions and take this step without hesitation. Once we take this step, perhaps the mountain of blades will become a flight of stairs, the sea of fire will become flowers, and the bottomless abyss will suddenly show a smooth path. But if we hesitate and miss that fleeting destiny, by the time you make up your mind to take that step, perhaps everything will already be different. Sophia and Chave listened to Alice's thoughts with solemn expressions. Since Alice was able to defeat the two of them when it came to the choice of destiny, she definitely had an understanding of destiny that was beyond their reach. After listening to Alice's honest words and combining them with their own actual situation, the two deputy leaders of the Witches of Destiny could not help but reveal bitter expressions. In the battle for the Tower of Destiny, at the end of the day, the two of them were not inferior to Alice, and were even superior to Alice in many aspects. But they still died. Why? The reason for their defeat was because they had prepared too many things for themselves and relied on too much. They were originally believers of destiny and only needed to believe in destiny for their entire lives. Even if they wore plain clothes, even if they did not have the strength to truss a chicken, even if they were surrounded by wolves, as long as they believed in destiny, then destiny would not abandon them. It would definitely guide them out of danger, a path of destiny that would allow them to survive. And it was precisely because they did not believe in destiny that they overly believed in their own abilities, as well as the weapons, scrolls, and potions that they had meticulously prepared. When danger descended, when destiny guided them on a path that seemed dangerous but could turn the situation around at the crucial moment, they did not choose to believe in destiny. Instead, they chose to believe in their own fists, believe in their own magic. As for the results, the berserk witch Sophia, who possessed powerful physical strength, was dead. Cheval, who possessed powerful ice witchcraft, had failed. Even the clone of the former Witch of Destiny, who had the upper hand in the battle, had disappeared. Even Alice, who was the weakest, became the victor and finally became the new leader of the Witches of Destiny. The charm within might be difficult for outsiders to understand, but as fellow Witches of Destiny, Sophia and Chave, they finally had a hint of understanding. Alice's rapid advancement on the path of destiny was probably related to her determination. She gave up all her abilities, gave up everything she relied on, and entrusted her entire life to destiny. Perhaps it was because of this that destiny chose to favor her more. As for herself, Sophia lowered her head to look at her huge iron fists, feeling the inexhaustible and violent power in her body, and finally shook her head helplessly. Her powerful physique and violent power had long since filled up her entire soul. Only with these things could she feel at peace, and only then could she feel her own strength. If she had to use these tangible things to exchange for the illusory favor of destiny, to be honest, she really could not do it. Ice Maiden Shefu felt the same way. The power of ice and snow surging in her body and blood vessels was her life. Giving up all of this to beg for the mercy of destiny, she seemed to find it difficult to give up. And it was precisely because of their hesitation that their progress on the path of destiny was extremely slow. Seeing that her two companions were moved, Alice smiled and said, "Destiny told me that my hope to advance lies here. So here we are. Destiny told me that even though this rescue mission will not allow me to directly obtain the Scepter of Prophecy, it will create a good opportunity for the subsequent operations. So no matter how dangerous the situation is, we can only participate. Since you believe in destiny so much, why do you still want to borrow the power of that wizard?" Sophia asked straightforwardly, directly revealing a question that had been bothering her for a long time. Even though Shefu wanted to stop Sophia from speaking nonsense, she hesitated for a moment before her gaze landed on Alice. To be honest, she had always wanted to find the answer to this question. The smile on Alice's face deepened. "We believe in destiny, but we cannot completely rely on destiny." Looking at the confused expressions on the two women's faces, Alice sighed faintly and said, "What is destiny?" It is a kind of rule that is subtly formed when the world operates. It has no thoughts, no emotions, and it is impossible for it to have mercy. As believers of destiny, We will receive preferential treatment from the power of destiny at all times and in everything. This can easily give people a misconception that they are the favored child of destiny, that they can always see ahead of time and control the pulse of destiny's development. Actually, this is just a misconception. We are not the controllers of destiny, nor are we the rulers of destiny. At the end of the day, we are just hard-working servants kneeling before destiny. Our duty is to ensure that the world moves forward according to the fixed trajectory of destiny, and think of ways to deal with those powerful individuals that try to disrupt the trajectory of destiny. And in this process, the blessing of destiny might make you extremely powerful for a moment, and you might even be able to play those peak experts in the palm of your hand. But as servants of destiny, we must be clear of our identities. We are still humble and weak individuals. Without the blessing of destiny, we are too weak. When destiny needs us, we will have limitless glory, and we will be able to stand at the peak of the dimension, on par with those peak experts. But once destiny no longer needs us, do you think that destiny will arrange a chance for us to retire and enjoy our remaining years? Hearing Alice's words, regardless of whether it was the burly and muscular Sophia or the intelligent and pure Chave, they were completely dumbfounded. Is this what a believer of destiny should say? As a follower of destiny, shouldn't Alice open her mouth and say, "I love destiny, and I will forever follow destiny," to become a fanatic believer? How could such words that question destiny come out of her mouth? Looking at the two women's dumbfounded expressions, Alice giggled. I have already said that destiny has no thoughts, no emotions. It will not push you to your death just because you scold it, nor will it arrange a smooth path for you just because you praise it. So, destiny is a kind of power, a merciless world-class power. And we are the servants chosen by destiny to protect our bodies and operations. Under the situation where the world is operating normally, destiny does not mind us using this identity to gradually strengthen ourselves. After all, the stronger we are, the better we can maintain the operation of the world. But once we grow to a certain extent, even our existence will become an obstacle or tumor to the normal operation of the world. When that time comes, it will be the time for a new person favored by destiny to appear. If we entrust all our power to destiny, when destiny abandons us, we will not even have the last bit of power to protect ourselves. Chave could not help but ask, "What does this have to do with that wizard?" Alice smiled sadly. If that day comes, he might be my only hope to survive, because, to all of us, to this world, he might be the only outsider. Outsider? Sophia and Chave frowned at the same time, evidently unfamiliar with this term. But no matter how much they asked, Alice just smiled silently and didn't explain anything. Unaware of the three women's debate about destiny, Grimm was currently focused on arranging the transportation of the giant floating ship. Large amounts of resources were transferred to the newly repaired giant floating ship. After many witches boarded the ship, the giant floating ship finally rose again, and under the cover of the night, it flew towards the direction of the Callan continent. The Callan continent under the night sky was so peaceful and serene. The dark shadows rose and fell with the terrain, and one could not see the end of it. Occasionally, the sharp cries of apes and the roars of beasts could be heard through the dense forest. But looking down from the ship's railings, it was pitch black, and it was difficult to see anything. After the giant floating ship entered the Callan continent, it followed the coastline all the way north. In the shadow of the ship's deck, Alice, who was wearing a thin robe, stood silently. Her blue eyes silently watched the thin clouds that were constantly smashing into the giant ship's force field protection. Don't forget, on this trip, I must know the whereabouts of the Pegasus Magic Spring. Otherwise, the cooperation between the Dark Witches and you will end here. An ethereal voice echoed beside Alice, echoing faintly in her ears. After Alice slightly nodded her head, the owner of the voice quietly left. It was only at this moment that Alice was able to truly enjoy the boundless scenery in front of her. Chapter 687. Mary was in a very dangerous situation. She risked her life to get rid of the elven prophet, which undoubtedly allowed the vampires to escape the pursuit of the elven legion. Unfortunately, she could not escape the pursuit of the grade 3 druid elder, Antoril. When a grade 3 powerhouse was enraged, the vampires could use their own personal experience to describe how powerful they could be. The day before yesterday, Mary had a team of 27 vampires under her command. But today, this number had been reduced to 16. And after the thunderbolt in the depths of the forest, this number had fallen again to 13. Looking into the distance, looking at the smoke rising from the secluded valley in the distance, Mary cursed bitterly. She had no choice but to lead her remaining subordinates into a deep ravine hidden in the dense forest. This ravine was a huge crack of unfathomable depth. The widest part of the crack could be up to 3 miles, and the narrowest part could barely fit a person. The crack was thousands of meters deep, and it was filled with pungent yellow smoke all day long. It was filled with the strong smell of sulfur. Below the fissure was a huge underground karst cave group that occupied an area of several hundred hectares. Inside, there were large and small caves, and the caves were connected to each other. It was simply a small underground world that extended in all directions. What lived here were strange magical beasts and magical plants that were hard to find on the surface. Hundreds of strange species and mysterious creatures had also created a unique life system in the underground world that was different from the outside world. Due to the harsh environment under the crack and the ferocious magical beasts, it had become a slightly famous, dangerous place in the Callan continent. Only the elves and druids who wanted to train themselves would enter it in an attempt to find some strange resources that could not be found in the outside world. But now, under Mary's lead, the desperate vampires could only take the risk and enter this small underground world to avoid the angry grade 3 druid elder. Just a quarter of an hour after Mary and the others entered the crack, the druid elder Antoril, whose beard and hair fluttered in the wind, wore an eagle helmet on his head, and was covered in leaf clothing, came out a lightning gate with a furious look on his face. When he came here, the strong smell of sulfur made him frown. Looking at the hundreds of miles long, deep chasm in front of him, the cracks on his forehead became even deeper and denser. The scar of death. It was actually the scar of death. Shushu. Elder Antoril let out a strange sound that sounded like a small beast's cry. Immediately, a strange little mouse crawled out from his green leaf clothes, jumped to the ground, stood up, and sniffed the surrounding air with its sharp nose. The upright mouse changed directions several times and finally aimed at the deep trench in front of it. It couldn't help but scream. Antoril tilted his head and listened for a moment, then whispered a few words to it before waving his hand and keeping it in his arms. With this strange lark, he could already confirm that the group of vampires was indeed hiding underground. This also meant that if he wanted to continue the chase, he could only take the risk of going deep into the Scar of Death and explore that strange underground world. Although he was a grade 3 and the famous son of nature, he still maintained an inexplicable reverence for the strange underground world under his feet. In that world, be it the powerful magical beasts or the strange magical plants, they all seemed extremely cruel and ruthless. Even with a druid's natural affinity, it was extremely difficult to talk to them. Many times, if they encountered those unreasonable fellows, even a druid could not avoid a battle to have a chance of escaping. There was once an elf prophet who came here to investigate and said that apart from the aura of the underground fire, there was also an indescribable evil smell. It seemed that there was an abnormally powerful evil creature hiding deep underground. For this reason, a few elven gods had even sent an elite team to carefully investigate the underground secrets. Unfortunately, the 3 elven powerhouses, including a Tier 4 elven oracle, a Tier 3 elven oracle, and a Tier 4 Galesword Saint, had mysteriously perished in the underground cavern's depths. As for the cause of their deaths, no one knew. Even the goddess of luck, Vicenna, could not predict it. Such a secret was naturally unknown to outsiders, and only the higher-ups of the elven race were fortunate enough to know about it. And as a druid elder, Antoril naturally had the ability and qualifications to know about it. Therefore, when he stood in front of the infamous Scar of Death, the hatred and rage in his heart finally erupted uncontrollably. Damn those evil witches. Why did they have to run into the Scar of Death? However, although the Scar of Death was infamous, it was a vast area with many underground passages. As long as one did not go too deep into the underground world, the probability of encountering danger was still very low. Antoril hesitated for a moment, then finally gritted his teeth, stomped his feet, and left his mark of nature on the spot before leaping into the terrifying bottomless chasm. The floating yellow smoke shook slightly and engulfed Antoril's body, making him disappear without a trace. After half a day, the trees near the chasm swayed, and a dozen elven warriors in green armor hurried over. They quickly discovered the mark of nature on the side of the chasm. After a simple verification, they left some of them to guard the side, while the rest scattered and rushed to different areas. After another half a day, a large group of elves riding flying magical beasts came from the central mountain range. They set up a simple camp around the mark of nature and sent some elven teams to the underground to search for the whereabouts of Elder Antoril and the witches. For a moment, the once deserted Scar of Death became lively and noisy once again. Grim and the others only arrived here 5 days later. Along the way, in order to avoid the elf scouts, the giant floating ship traveled at night and took a big detour before sneaking into the area. It was in this area that Mary's aura disappeared. After hiding the giant floating ship, Grim led Alice and the Witch of Ulthur into the dense forest. Under the guidance of witchcraft, they slowly approached the Scar of Death from the other side. The Scar of Death stretched for hundreds of miles, and the elves naturally could not guard every area tightly. Therefore, after finding a gap, the three of them quietly sneaked into the terrifying chasm. Unlike what they had imagined, the underground was not a land of death where all life was extinguished. Black soil, strange and twisted plants, and countless strange magical beasts that they could not name. For some reason, the three of them had a strange feeling that they were in the black forest of the sorcerer's world. Scarlet tree, killer vine, three-headed monster, green-feathered snake, two-headed lizard, cannibal whipper. The terrain and flora and fauna here were surprisingly similar to the black forest of the sorcerer's world. However, the density of the magical aura here could not compare to the sorcerer's world, so the magical plants and animals here were slightly weaker. They were not as fierce and evil as the magical beasts and plants in the sorcerer's world. More importantly, once they stepped into this place, the plane's consciousness that had been suppressing them for a long time suddenly weakened, giving them more room to display their strength. Another dimension? This place gave off the feeling of a miniature alternate dimension. It was completely incompatible with the consciousness of the Faerun Plane, and it was also the exact opposite of the forest elf's force of nature. According to the common sense of plane development, a plane with a powerful god shouldn't give birth to such a strange alternate dimension. If it was not formed naturally, it meant that there was an extremely powerful source of energy in the depths of this huge chasm. It was precisely because of its long years of infection that this area broke away from the control of the Faerun Plane's consciousness, becoming an alternate dimension that the elves did not dare to step into easily. The forest elves living in the Faerun Plane did not have enough knowledge and theories about the plane, so they could not recognize the true nature of this dimension. However, Ulthur, Alice, and Grim were all knowledgeable and experienced people. They had only ventured 3 miles into the Scar of Death, but they had already sensed the abnormality in the spatial structure. In this underground world, they could no longer sense much of the consciousness of the Faerun Plane. Instead, there was a thick smell of death. The deeper they went, the more death-type magical beasts and plants they saw. Ghost tree, withered vine, vampire vine, poisonous moss, human face flower, devil taro grass, snakehead fungus, and countless strange undead. Yes, this place had become a lost paradise for the undead. Although they had disguised themselves as strange magical beasts and plants, the stench of the source of death could not escape the senses of the three magi. Grimm and the others found very obvious traces of human modification on their bodies. This meant that these undead were not born naturally, but had been modified by a powerful existence using some strange method. Along the way, these mutated undead were like the most loyal servants. When they saw Grimm and the others, they would madly pounce at them, as if trying to stop them from going deeper underground. At this point, it was wishful thinking to think that they could safely pass through these mutated undead. The only way was to fight their way through. Ulthar naturally did not want to fight these magical beasts and plants that were only around grade 1, and Alice had long since lost her ability to cast spells. Hence, Grimm became the only coolie in the group, and could only silently lead the way. Chapter 688. It was a dark underground cave without any light. The ground was filled with black, damp soil, and there were a few strangely shaped magical plants growing here and there. The walls around the cave had been eroded by the rain all year round. Most of the loose sand and soil had already peeled off, leaving only the hard, steel-like walls and shimmering moss. The light here was dim to begin with, and even if there was the lustrous green light emitted by the glimmering moss, it was impossible for it to illuminate this vast and boundless underground space. Instead, it made this place seem even more spacious and deep, and it gave one a strange and oppressive feeling. A faint mist floated in the caverns of all sizes, shrouding everything in a hazy mist. Grimm took the lead, the dark red flame boundary around his body clashing with the water vapor, constantly emitting sizzling sounds. The damp ground quickly turned into dry, loose sand under the heat of the flame barrier. Stepping on it with deerskin short boots, Xian felt like he was riding on the clouds. The dark red flame barrier was like a red-hot sharp knife, cutting open the fog in front of them and driving the hazy water vapor to the sides of the road. The magical plants that grew sporadically in the depths of the mist were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. They looked like terrifying demons that had crawled out of hell. Between the demonic plants, some hideous and twisted monsters were roaming around, howling and wobbling. As if they had smelled the scent of life, a series of monster howls came from the depths of the mist on the right. Then, the mist parted, and a large group of rotten zombies appeared in Grimm's sight. They raised their dirty, black hands and rushed at the three of them. They were rotten zombies that had been sleeping underground for many years. Their originally plump bodies were now completely shriveled. Their abdomens were deeply caved in, and the sparse hair on their heads was yellow and withered. Countless worms were wriggling in and out of their empty eye sockets, nostrils, and mouths. Sensing the intruders, these rotten zombies that were supposed to be watchdogs became unusually agitated. Their empty eye sockets lit up with a terrifying red light, and their slanted mouths twisted and deformed. Oh, whoa. This group of almost 100 rotten zombies did not care about the huge difference in strength between them and continued to rush forward while howling dryly. As soon as they entered the range of the flame barrier, water vapor immediately rose from their rotten and sticky bodies. Then, countless small flames sprang up. Before they could get close to the three of them, the rapidly rising flames engulfed their evil and ugly bodies, drowning everything in the raging flames. The three of them had long held their breaths, and they walked among the human-shaped torches with a disgusted expression. To those that got too close, Grimm casually flicked out a small orange flame. Although the flames were small, when they landed on the bodies of the zombies, they could instantly burn through their tough skin, which was as tough as old cowhide, and then ignite everything that could be ignited. These low-level undead creatures whose basic strength was only at the apprentice level at most could not resist the dual effects of the flame barrier and the ignition spell at all. One by one, they howled and fell to the ground, burning into a lump of indistinguishable charcoal amidst the painful struggle and distortion. As if sensing the power of the three of them, the scary demonic plants that were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws also quieted down. In the depths of the mist where the three of them could not see, the scarlet tree retracted its thick snake-like roots and lowered its bony branches, disguising itself as a dead tree. The vines that wrapped around the scarlet tree also retracted their withered and shriveled tentacles, sticking to the trunk without moving. They were no longer as active as before. The giant, man-eating flagellants that blocked the path of the three of them pulled out their roots with difficulty and slowly wriggled to the sides. The sunflower-like flower at the top of the stem closed its petals, blocking the protruding human face. As the three of them approached, the paradise of death that was still whispering to each other suddenly became very quiet. The greedy gazes that shot out from the dark turned away. They no longer dared to provoke these terrifying witchcraft casters. Grim turned around and looked at Alice. Alice shook her head and said, "I can't sense Mary's aura. This is a paradise for the undead, and it's a good place for vampires to hide. If I were Mary, I would definitely go deeper and use the native undead to deal with that druid." Ulthar, who had been observing the surroundings coldly, could not help but interrupt. "It's best if we don't go too deep. You should be able to tell that most of the undead here are not natural creatures. They've been artificially modified. This means that there's a powerful master behind them. Are you worried that it's a grade 4 hermit?" Grim pondered. It's not like you can't tell the situation here. A grade 3 wizard can't make such a big fuss, right? I was certain that a powerful rank 4 undead had connected this underground space to some other dimension, and the low-level undead here were the scouts that it had set up in the periphery. If we go too deep, we might anger the other party, and there'll be unpredictable dangers. Ulthar was obviously a little wary of this place. "Do you feel any danger?" Grim threw the question back to Alice. This time, even Ulthar focused his attention on Alice. The Destiny Witches were people who were good at avoiding danger. If there was danger ahead, they would definitely sense it. Alice took out a translucent crystal ball from her bosom and held it in her hand for a moment. She shook her head and said, "There's risk, but there's no danger. Even." After hesitating for a long time, Alice did not know how to describe what she felt. "I have a feeling that this trip will be very beneficial for us." Grim and Ulthar breathed a sigh of relief. "Since that's the case, let's continue. I want to see what the true master of this place looks like." As a grade 3, which Ulthar's opinion was obviously very important. After all, Ulthar was the core of this battle to deal with that druid elder. Although Grim had the ability to summon a grade 3 thunder dragon, he had to pay a huge price every time he did so. Moreover, a grade 3 druid elder would not give him enough time to complete the summoning. However, as they continued to move forward, the three of them soon encountered a new wave of undead creatures. Vengeful spirits, wraiths, and phantoms were like a group of translucent ghosts, hiding in the thick fog and constantly letting out ghostly cries. Compared to the spirits of the sorcerer world, these vengeful spirits made from the souls of living creatures were less evil, but more vicious. They couldn't help but let out a heart-wrenching, eerie laughter as they circled around the dark red flame barrier. Some of the vengeful spirits that could not restrain their ferocious nature tried to rush into the barrier, but in the next moment, they let out even more terrifying shrieks and turned around to rush out. Unfortunately, they did not have a physical body to hide, so the core of their vengeful spirits was directly exposed within the flame barrier. In less than 3 seconds, a vengeful spirit with the strength of a high-ranked apprentice was burned to a pile of ashes. The vengeful spirits at the back understood how terrifying this dark red barrier was. They circled around even faster, and their eerie laughter became even more eerie. However, they did not dare to step into the flame barrier. However, not all of the vengeful spirits that appeared here were low-ranked ones. Following a series of enchanting giggles, beautiful girls with voluptuous bodies, low-cut dresses, and light muslin began to appear in the fog. They giggled as they chased each other. Occasionally, they would rush out of the fog, only to leave behind a beautiful glimpse of them before they hid back into the depths of the fog while giggling. Those breathtakingly beautiful faces, those towering, white, and perfectly round breasts, those enchanting laughter, and those illusory, hazy, and hot bodies, the three of them under the cover of the flame barrier all had cold, disdainful smiles on their faces. Next to them, there was a strange magical glow. From the looks of it, it was a sign that a charm spell was being used frequently. These female charms could be considered high-rank spirits, and their strength could also reach grade 1. However, after being tortured, they had lost a lot of intelligence. Obviously, they could not compare to a grade 1 wizard. If it was a grade 1 wizard, they would have run as far as they could when they saw Grimm and the others. There was no way they would be so reckless as to flirt in front of a high-ranked wizard. Their self-righteous charm was obviously unable to shake the minds of Grimm and the others. Hence, after a series of disturbances, the Banshee leader who had been hiding behind them proudly made her appearance. A high-rank grade 1 Banshee. Compared to her subordinates, this Banshee leader's spirit body was undoubtedly more solid and did not have the illusory and hazy feeling that other Banshees had. She was wearing a light green evening gown and a pair of exquisite transparent crystal heels. Stepping in the air, she gracefully walked out of the deep darkness. "Little handsome, your body is so strong and mighty." The Banshee leader spoke with a voice so sweet that it could make one's limbs go soft. A pair of slender, snow-white hands slowly caressed her own body, and she lightly licked her red lips. That alluring face of hers that could topple a nation was filled with lust. Hurry up and use your burning passion to warm my lonely body." To be honest, if Grimm was just a normal traveler, his soul would have left his body at this moment, and he would be like a puppet as he foolishly walked into the embrace of the Banshee leader. Unfortunately, he was not. Even with the two witches standing behind him, it was difficult for him to even pretend to be charmed. Chapter 689. Not only was the human in the dark red barrier not bewitched, but he was also laughing unrestrainedly. This undoubtedly provoked the Banshee leader. Following a strange flash of light and shadow, the graceful beauty turned into a tall and handsome young man in the next second. "Beauty, let's have a heart-to-heart talk and talk about our future." Seeing that Grimm was unmoved, the Banshee leader turned her attention to Alice. Alice, who had been smiling coquettishly just a moment ago, had a frosty expression on her face. She waved her hand, and a glowing card of fate slid into her palm. "You don't have to do anything. Leave this interesting fellow to me. I'll bring him back to train him. He might make a good slave." Ulthar laughed sinisterly and reached out to grab the Banshee leader. A huge shadow instantly enveloped her. She did not even have the chance to struggle. When the huge shadow dissipated with a bang, the Banshee leader had already disappeared from where she stood, never to be seen again. Seeing that their leader had been captured, the rest of the Banshees charged towards the dark red barrier with a shrill cry. Unfortunately, everyone that entered died. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the vengeful spirits and Banshees that filled the sky were killed in half a minute. The remaining Banshees saw that the situation was not good, and with a shrill cry, they scattered into the thick fog and escaped. At this moment, the sound of bones grinding against each other could be heard. A large group of skeleton warriors came out of the fog in a neat formation. With a silent roar, the skeleton warriors' empty eye sockets lit up with red light. It raised its crude bone blade and bone shield and charged at Grimm and the others bravely. With the AI chip's strengthened senses, Grimm could clearly see the skeleton army, ghouls, as well as the mountain of terrifying stitch monsters that were pouring out of the caves. Their individual strength might not be particularly high, but their sheer numbers made Grimm, a Tier 2 fire shaman, frown involuntarily. An undead army. Grimm muttered to himself. Most necromancy spellcasters could transform and mutate, some powerful undead creatures. But there were only a few creatures that could command the undead creatures to form a massive undead army. Grade 4 necromancers who specialized in summoning and modifying undead creatures could do it. Apart from that, perhaps only high-level liches or undead lords who were also undead creatures could do it. But in a middle-ranked plane that had been invaded by the Pale Witches for thousands of years, what was the probability of an undead lord suddenly appearing? The probability was not much higher than the probability of a normal human being struck by lightning. After all, according to the power system of the Magi, liches started at grade 3. On the other hand, the undead monarchs often commanded thousands upon thousands of undead creatures, occupied some small planes, and lived a comfortable life of supremacy. With their strength, even the weakest undead monarch was at least a grade 5 undead monarch. If not for the fact that the plane had been destroyed and its consciousness had fallen, ordinary material planes would not be able to accommodate an undead lord of such a level. But there was no time to think about it. Grimm took a step forward and flipped his hands. 2 balls of scarlet flames floated in his palms. As the fire elemental energy in the underground world sizzled and gathered at the core of the flames, the 2 fist-sized balls of flames grew in size in just a few seconds. The fire elemental energy within them was extremely dense and violent. Following Grimm's soft shout, 2 violent fireballs were pushed out by him. The fireballs drew 2 beautiful arcs in the air and landed in the center of the skeleton core far away. Asterisk dong dong. Asterisk after a dull explosion, the 2 pillars of scarlet flames turned into waves of flames that burned everything around them to ashes. Although these skeleton warriors had undergone simple magic refinement, their basic strength was only slightly stronger than immortals. Although their skeletal bodies were immune to sharp weapons, they did not have much resistance to magic. Hence, as the waves of flames rolled over them, the skeleton warriors melted into a pile of charcoal like hot wax. Then, they were washed away by the flames and turned into ashes. At this moment, Grimm could no longer hide his strength. The fire barrier that had only enveloped a radius of 10 steps suddenly expanded outwards, covering everything within 100 meters in dark red flames. But even so, it still couldn't stop the skeleton warriors from rushing into Grimm's flame barrier. These skeleton warriors were only at the level of a junior apprentice and could only survive for 3 seconds. The soul flames hidden in their sinister skulls could only last for 1 second, while their tough skeletal bodies could last for 2 seconds. Relying on this small time difference, the soul flames of a batch of skeleton warriors were extinguished as soon as they entered the flame barrier. Before their loose bodies could disperse, they were pushed forward by the skeletal warriors behind them. By the time the first batch of skeleton warriors had been incinerated, the second batch of skeleton warriors were already 6 to 7 meters away from the flame barrier. Relying on their terrifying numbers, a wall of pure white bones quickly approached Grimm. A bunch of mindless low-grade skeletons wanted to kill a grade 2 fire shaman with their numbers. A cold expression appeared on Grimm's face. He grabbed with both hands and quickly threw them. Lava fireballs were like guided missiles as they whizzed towards the densest area of the skeleton legion. Following that, the violent flame shockwaves and the scorching lava that rained down from the sky turned the small cave into a cruel and unbearable lava hell. Even after suffering such a fierce attack, the skeleton army continued to attack Grimm's flame barrier with all their might. In the depths of the thick fog, squads of white ghouls also began to enter the battlefield. Unlike the grade 1 ghouls created by the Magi, these mass-produced ghouls were much weaker. They were like a group of skinned humans that had been soaked in a stinky ditch for a few days. Their bodies emitted a pungent stench, and they were deathly pale, as if they had drowned. Their tendons and bones had been stretched out beyond recognition, and they no longer looked like humans. Their bodies were covered with sticky and slippery body fluids, and their stooped bodies were crawling on the ground like wild beasts. Coupled with their sharp claws, terrifying fangs, and long tongues that kept retracting and retracting, These ghouls were all at least as strong as high-ranked acolytes, and their numbers were shocking. At least according to Grimm's AI, chips, scan, and mental perception, there seemed to be an endless stream of ghouls pouring out of the caves. They stepped on the skeletons of the skeleton warriors as they charged forward, some even climbing the slippery walls of the cave. They pounced on Grimm, who was standing proudly in the middle of the dark red barrier. Grimm's expression gradually darkened. Damn it, there seems to be too many undead here. Based on the strength of the undead before him, it was impossible for them to kill a Grade 2 Magus. After all, their basic strength was still there, and their attacks could not break through the defensive spells of a Grade 2 Magus. However, the situation before him was obviously not what he had expected. These undead did not have any fighting spirit, nor did they have any emotional fluctuations. They were like a tidal wave, crazily charging at the flame barrier from all directions. They were like a swarm of ants that were covered in flames. No matter how many of them were burned to death, they were still advancing with all their might. Now, with the addition of these agile ghouls, the undead army's assault on the flame barrier was even more unstoppable. The white ghouls crawled all over the dark cave walls, and one by one, they leaped down without a care for their own safety. Even though their naked bodies were scorched black by the dark flames, their withered bodies still pounced towards Grimm. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk a series of muffled explosions rang out. The burnt corpses of these ghouls were blocked by Grimm's flame shield and lava shield. However, Grimm had no choice but to stop after receiving the continuous assault. Grimm could not help but frown as he looked at the white figures pouncing towards him. These fellows did not seem easy to deal with. Left with no choice, Grimm could only raise his hand and summon the 5-meter-tall flame demon. He had it stand in front of him, and it lashed out at the incoming ghouls with its flaming whip. As for those that managed to escape, even if they managed to bite him, they would be burnt to a crisp by the flames spewing out of his body. With the flame demon leading the way, the swarming undead could no longer pose a threat to Grimm's group. They could only frantically charge at the tall giant. The flame demon was not afraid of falling into the enemy's formation. It moved its thick legs and charged straight into the densest area of the undead. As it raised its hands, a large area of effect meteor shower turned the entire undead army upside down, causing them to be utterly defeated. The white ghouls swarmed forward and almost covered the flame demon's huge body. The flame demon roared, and terrifying flames of up to 2,000 to 3,000 degrees gushed out from the cracks of its tough magma body. Even with the tough bodies of the ghouls, it was difficult for them to withstand this degree of magical damage. They were instantly vaporized like coyotes that fell into a volcano, and not even ashes were left behind. But even so, they could not stop the ghouls from pouncing forward. Even the flame demon's huge body, which was made of pure magma and flames, had visible cracks and damage. Chapter 690. Many ants could kill an elephant. This was an old saying that Grimm had looked down on in the past, but now it was being used in front of him. He found it hard to accept. If the Balrog was facing off against the humans, the human army would have collapsed the moment Lord Gao's roar appeared. How could they be like the undead, fearlessly using their bodies and numbers to push back their enemies? The Balrog had only appeared for a few minutes, but had already incinerated tens of thousands of undead. However, the tide of undead still showed no signs of decreasing. As the undead swarmed out of the caverns, they occupied every inch of space in the massive cavern. They were attacking the Balrog and Grimm's group of 3 from all directions. Among the 3 of them, Alice was the weakest. Although she had a few sealed cards of fate that could summon a few wizard beasts or servants, summoning summon creatures below Tier 2 would be suicidal in a situation like today's. Even if it was a Tier 2 summon creature, if its physique and strength were slightly weaker, it could only wait for death. Therefore, facing the current situation, Grimm could only erupt with large-scale fire spells. Flaming Storm, Meteor Shower, Mount Doomsday. These undead creatures had weak physiques, and strength, and the only thing they had to worry about was their terrifying numbers. Hence, Grimm's fire spells were not powerful, but they covered a large area and lasted for a long time. After clearing the cavern, the flames would be extinguished, but within half a minute, the undead would swarm in and occupy the cavern once more. After another explosion, the remaining flames would be extinguished, and a new wave of undead would swarm in. Even with the support of the flame core, Grimm's endurance far surpassed ordinary elemental sorcerers. However, casting large-scale spells so frequently still put a lot of pressure on his body. Fortunately, he had the Balrog's help. The two of them took turns to attack, alleviating some of the pressure on Grimm. Meanwhile, Ulthar, who was at the back of the team, watched the battle silently. However, as Grimm attacked again and again, the Tier 3 Dark Witch's face, which was covered by the shadows, started to reveal a trace of surprise. This wizard's power of fire was very pure, and it had a strong aftereffect that was beyond his expectations. Judging from a scale of the undead army, Ulthar thought the wizard would have asked for help a long time ago. But no matter how dangerous the situation was, this guy named Grimm was still struggling. Moreover, the dark red flame barrier that he propped up not only withstood the attacks of thousands of undead, but also tightly protected the two witches who were hiding behind him. Alice had an ambiguous relationship with him, so it was not surprising that he would deliberately protect her. However, Sure Fang's dark red flame barrier had trapped the Tier 3 Dark Witch, Ulthar. He had no intention of dragging her into the fray just because she was much stronger than he was. This surprised Ulthar, who had always been proud of her identity as a witch, and also made her a little angry. Does he really think that all witches are as delicate and weak as Alice? Does he really think that all witches are as weak as Alice? After all, in the north, it was the powerful northern witches who held up the sky. In front of the real northern witches, the so-called wizards were nothing more than tools for entertainment and decorations. Hence, the more Grimm protected Ulthar, the deeper the shadows in Ulthar's eyes became. Anyone who was familiar with the Dark Witch would know that this was a sign that the Tier 3 Dark Witch had lost control of her anger. However, there was no one worthy of her anger, so Ulthar could only accumulate the anger in her heart and burn it in her shriveled chest. Perhaps it had sensed that the price of using the low-ranked undead to kill the group of magi was too high. Hence, with the crisp sound of hooves, an undead knight clad in metal armor and with a helmet covering its face rode out from the depths of the fog on a huge skeletal warhorse. As a high-tiered undead, the undead knight's every movement carried a domineering aura. All the skeletal warriors and ghouls around it naturally hid to the sides, not a single undead daring to get within 5 meters of it. A level 2 undead knight. Looking at the black fog surrounding it, it was obviously a dark knight that had grasped the energy of darkness. Behind the dark knight, the sound of bones rubbing against each other could be heard, and a large group of skeletons appeared in front of them leisurely. Looking at the skeletons' white bone armor, the white bone daggers at their waists, the white bone rings on their heads, and the white bone staffs in their hands, Grimm's heart sank. They were undead spellcasters. Although the aura they released was not very strong, they were at least a Tier 1 skeleton wizard. However, spellcasters were spellcasters, and they could not deal with them as casually as they did with ordinary undead. The undead were undead creatures formed by some broken souls attached to broken bones. If the broken soul was a powerful spellcaster when it was alive, it might have retained a portion of its casting techniques and knowledge. If such a soul landed on a broken skeleton, it could become the most basic skeleton wizard. If it landed on a zombie, it could become a zombie wizard. After thousands of years of accumulation and evolution, the skeleton wizard could become the current skeleton wizard, and the zombie wizard could become the terrifying lich. After becoming an undead spellcaster, no matter what the soul's innate ability was, it would naturally change to the necromancy element. The skeleton wizards were naturally most proficient in bone spells. Hence, as soon as the skeleton wizards appeared, a large group of white bone spears shot towards them like raindrops. Bone Spear, a Tier 1 bone spell. Attack, 35 to 50 degrees. The tip of the bone spear would explode upon hitting the target, causing splash damage of around 3 degrees. In addition, the bone spear would also carry around 5 degrees of negative energy damage. Note, creatures with negative energy are immune to it. The moment the white bone spears appeared in his field of vision, the AI chip's scan data was projected into Grimm's mind. In truth, the power of a single bone spear could be considered weak, not even worthy of being a Tier 1 spell. It could barely match the strength of a high-ranked acolyte in the Magus world. However, it could not withstand the concentrated attacks. The bone spears shot by over 100 skeleton wizards did not stop piercing the dark red flame barrier. The negative energy on the bone spears clashed with the fire elemental energy, causing a slight elemental explosion in the air. However, the bone spears that were stronger than steel still managed to withstand the dark flames, piercing into the lava body of the Balrog. With a huge Balrog in front, the rest of the bone spears were blocked by Grimm's lava shield. The first wave of attacks did not cause any damage to the three. However, as the master of the Balrog, Grimm could sense it clearly. In order to withstand this volley of bone spears, the Balrog's elemental reserves in its heart had been reduced by 6%. If they did not think of a way to eliminate these skeleton wizards, the Balrog would eventually be beaten back to its original state, no matter how powerful it was. Grimm's eyes flickered, and he issued a series of commands. The terrifying flame demon that had been standing in front of him suddenly roared at the sky, and its entire body suddenly disappeared in the huge ring of flames that soared into the sky. Flame Leap. Under Grimm's command, the Balrog used Flame Leap to instantly appear in the middle of the skeleton wizard's formation. It did not even need to activate any spells. Just the lava shield and the high-temperature flames around its body were enough to deal a terrifying amount of damage to the skeleton wizards. But just as the terrifying Balrog raised its hands and was about to use a powerful fire spell to bury the bone spellcasters, a black lightning bolt flew out from the side and pierced through the lava shield around its body. It pierced through 3 of the flame shields and pierced through its chest in one fell swoop. This sudden attack caused Grimm's brows to twitch. He could not help but cast a cold gaze at the Tier 2 Dark Knight. Just now, it was the Dark Knight that had thrown its 4-meter-long spear, piercing through the Balrog's lava body. Through the AI chip scan, Grimm could clearly see the power of the Dark Knight's attack. 519 degrees. For a Tier 2 Dark Knight, this was a shocking number. Through the Dark Knight's attack, the AI chip could roughly estimate the Dark Knight's basic stats. Dark Knight, Tier 2 undead creature that has mastered dark magic. Basic stats: Strength, 21-23 Vitality, greater than 20 Agility, greater than 15 Spirit, greater than 13. This undead creature's vitality was much higher than Grimm's, who had advanced to Tier 2. After all, Grimm was an elemental magus and did not invest too much in vitality and strength. Only by transforming into the Balrog could Grimm's strength and vitality exceed 15 points, and he could barely hold his own against these Tier 2 magi. However, as a Tier 2 elemental magus that specialized in fire, Grimm's spirit was at 27 points, which was a good starting point for a Tier 2 magus. Hence, if Grimm wanted to fight this Dark Knight, the best way to do so was to maintain a certain distance from it and drown it with powerful fire spells. However, just as Grimm was about to step forward, the cold voice of the Outhar Magus came from behind him. "You stay here. Leave the Dark Knight to me." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.